Welcome to NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, we sail beyond the shores, into a world of waves and ancient secrets. In this 50-chapter epic saga, we follow the trail of Captain Thorne and the Black Serpent. Adjust your pillows, close your eyes, and let the whispers of the deep carry you away. We are setting sail. Captain Thorne sat in his small cabin. The room was dark and smelled like old salt and dry paper. He was a tall man with a grey beard and hands that were rough from years of pulling ropes. He was 45 years old, and he spent most of those years on the big, blue ocean. Today, he was not looking at the sea. He was looking at a small, wooden box on his desk. The box was very old. It had dust on the top and a heavy metal lock. Thorne took a small key from his pocket. He put the key into the lock and turned it. The metal made a low, scraping noise as it opened. Inside the box, sitting on a piece of red silk, was a compass. This was not a normal compass. It was made of dark, heavy bronze. There were strange drawings of trees and stars on the side of it. Thorne picked it up. It felt very heavy in his hand, much heavier than a normal compass. He held it flat and waited for the needle to move. Usually, a compass needle points north, but this needle did not move toward the north. It spun around quickly 3 times and then stopped. It pointed directly toward the window. Thorne looked out of the window. In the distance, he saw the great jungle. The jungle was a place of deep green trees and dangerous animals. No one went there because the forest was too thick and the mountains were too high. Thorne moved to the other side of the room. He watched the needle. The needle moved with him. It stayed pointed at the jungle. He turned the compass upside down and then right side up again. The needle did not shake. It was like a finger pointing at a secret. So, the stories are true, Thorne said quietly. His voice was deep and calm. He remembered the stories from his grandfather. The stories spoke of a great green stone called the Emerald of the Deep. People said the emerald was hidden in a temple where the sun never touched the ground. They said only a special compass could find the way. Many sailors looked for it many years ago, but they all failed. They were lost in the green shadows of the trees. Thorne was not a man who felt fear easily. He was a brave captain, and he had a strong ship called the Black Serpent. He knew that he could find the treasure if he had the right people with him. He put the compass into a leather bag and tied it to his belt. He felt the weight of it against his leg. He stood up and walked out of his cabin. The sun was going down, and the sky was a bright orange color. The air was warm and smelled like tropical flowers. He looked at his ship. It was a beautiful ship with tall masts and clean decks. He saw his sailors working. They were all adults who knew the sea well. The journey starts tomorrow. Thorne thought. He needed to find his friend Martha. She was the best navigator in the city, and she was the only person he trusted with this secret. He walked down the wooden stairs of the ship and toward the lights of the port. Thorne walked through the dark streets of the port. The air was thick with the smell of fish and old wood. He arrived at a tavern called the Lucky Anchor. It was a place where many sailors went to drink and talk after a long day at sea. Thorne pushed the heavy wooden door open. Inside, the room was warm. Many people sat at round tables. They laughed and told stories about the ocean. Thorne looked around the room. He was looking for one person. He finally saw her in a quiet corner. Martha sat alone at a small table. She was a strong woman of 40 years. Her face was brown from the sun, and she had a long scar on her left arm from an old battle. She was looking at a map and drinking a cup of tea. Martha was the best navigator in the city. She knew every rock and every wave in the sea. Thorne walked to her table and sat down. Martha did not look up from her map. "I have no time for small talk, Thorne," she said. Her voice was sharp but friendly. "I am preparing for a trip to the north." The north is cold and has no gold. Thorne replied quietly, I have a better plan. I have a plan for the deep. Martha stopped moving. She looked up and met Thorne's eyes. She saw that he was serious. She folded her map slowly and put it in her bag. The deep is a dangerous place. Martha said, people do not return from there. What do you have that other captains do not have? Thorne did not speak. He reached into his leather bag and pulled out the heavy bronze compass. He placed it on the table between them. Martha looked at it. She saw the strange stars and the green light in the center. She saw the needle. It was pointing directly at the wall, toward the great jungle. She tried to turn the compass, but the needle stayed in the same position. Where did you find this? She whispered. She reached out a finger but did not touch it. It was in my grandfather's box. Thorne said, it points to the emerald of the deep. I have the ship, and I have the coin for supplies. But I need a navigator who can read the stars when the compass is not enough. I need you, Martha. Martha looked at the compass for a long time. She was an adult who liked facts and logic. But this compass was like magic. She thought about her quiet life in the port. She wanted a new adventure. She wanted to be the first person to see the green fire. I want half of the gold we find. Martha said, that is too much. Thorne replied, I will give you a quarter, and you will be the second in command on the Black Serpent. Martha smiled. She stood up and held out her hand. Thorne stood up too. They shook hands. Their hands were both rough and strong. We leave at sunrise. Thorne said, I will be at the docks. Martha replied. Thorne put the compass back in his bag and left the tavern. He felt happy. He had his navigator. Now, the real work began. He had to go back to his ship and prepare his crew for the greatest journey of their lives. The morning sun was low in the sky. It cast a golden light over the busy port. Captain Thorne stood on the deck of the Black Serpent. He looked at the wooden boards under his feet. The ship was 20 years old, but it was fast and strong. He needed it to be perfect for this trip. Martha arrived at the docks soon after. She carried a heavy bag on her shoulder. She looked at the ship and then at Thorne. The ship is beautiful, Thorne, she said. But it is empty. We cannot eat wood and salt water on the ocean. Thorne nodded. You are right. Let's go to the market. They walked to the center of the port. The market was full of people. Merchants talked loudly about their fruit, fish, and clothes. The air was full of the smell of spices and fresh bread. Thorne and Martha went to a large shop near the water. An old man with a bald head greeted them. He was a merchant who sold supplies to many captains. I need supplies for a long journey. Thorne told the man. We need 200 kilograms of dried meat and many bags of hard bread. The bread must stay good for many months. The merchant nodded and started to write on a piece of paper. Martha looked at the large wooden barrels in the corner. We need 20 barrels of fresh water, she added, and 3 large barrels of fruit juice. It keeps the sailors healthy during long weeks at sea. Thorne also bought new ropes. The old ropes on the ship were thin and weak. He touched the new ropes. They were thick and felt rough against his skin. They smelled like tar and fresh hemp. He knew these ropes would not break during a heavy storm. He paid the merchant with several gold coins. While the workers moved the supplies to the ship, Thorne and Martha checked the sails. One of the sails had a small hole. Thorne called his first mate, a man named Arthur. Arthur was 50 years old and had very strong arms. Arthur, fix this sail today. Thorne said, we cannot lose time when the wind is strong. We need every sail to be perfect. By the afternoon, The deck of the Black Serpent was very busy. Men and women carried heavy boxes and barrels up the wooden plank. They worked hard under the warm sun. Their shirts were wet with sweat. Thorne watched them. He felt a mix of excitement and worry. The emerald was a great prize, but the sea was a dangerous place for everyone. "Everything is ready," Martha said. She stood next to him and looked at the horizon. "The food is on the ship. The water is safe. The ropes are strong." "Good," Thorne said. He felt the heavy compass in his pocket. It felt warm against his leg. "Tell the crew to eat well tonight. Tomorrow, we leave the world we know." The crew finished their work as the sun went down. The ship was now heavy with everything they needed. It sat lower in the water. Thorne stayed on the deck for a long time. He looked at the stars. He knew the path would be hard, but he was ready to face the deep. The sun rose over the hills behind the port. The sky was pink and gold. Captain Thorne stood at the front of the ship. He looked at the water. It was calm and dark. This was the moment he waited for. He felt a light wind on his face. It was a good wind. It was a wind that wanted to go to the ocean. "Everyone to your places," Thorne shouted. His voice was loud and clear. It traveled across the deck. The sailors moved quickly. These were not young men or women. They were experienced adults. They knew their jobs well. Martha stood near the large wooden wheel. She checked the position of the sun and the stars that were still visible. Arthur, the first mate, stood with the men at the front. "The anchor is heavy today," Arthur said. He smiled at Thorne. "The ship is heavy with gold and food." "Arthur," Thorne replied. "Pull it up." The sailors grabbed the thick iron chain. They worked together. They pushed a large wooden machine called the capstan. It was hard work. Their muscles were tight, and their faces were red. They moved in a circle, round and round. The metal chain moved slowly out of the dark water. It was covered in green seaweed and wet sand. There was no sound of a bell or a whistle. Instead, the sailors sang a low, rhythmic song to keep their pace. Thorne watched the chain. Finally, the large, heavy anchor came out of the water. It hung against the side of the ship. "The anchor is up." "Captain," Arthur called out. "Lower the sails," Thorne commanded. The crew pulled the ropes. The large white sails fell from the masts. At first, the sails were loose and moved in the air. Then, the wind caught them. The fabric became tight and hard. The ship began to move. At first, it moved very slowly. Then, it moved faster. The front of the ship cut through the small waves. The water moved away from the wood with a soft, splashing sound. Thorne walked to the back of the ship and stood next to Martha. She held the wheel with both hands. She looked ahead at the blue horizon. Behind them, the city of the port started to look small. The houses were like tiny boxes. The people on the docks were like small dots. "We are on our way," Martha said. She did not look back. She only looked forward. "Yes," Thorne said. He took the compass out of his bag. He held it flat. The needle pointed away from the land and toward the deep, open sea. The jungle was far away, hidden by the curve of the world, but the compass knew the way. The port was now far behind. There was only the blue water and the white birds in the sky. The air felt different here. It was saltier and colder. The adventure was no longer a plan in a tavern. It was real. The Black Serpent was alone on the great ocean. 3 days passed. The land was now a memory. In every direction, the crew saw only the blue water and the blue sky. The line where the sea met the sky was perfectly straight. This was the blue horizon. It was beautiful, But it was also lonely. The sun was hot during the day, and the wind was steady. Captain Thorne spent much of his time on the deck. He liked to watch the water. Sometimes, he saw large silver fish jump out of the waves. They sparkled in the light for a second and then disappeared back into the deep. He also watched his crew. They were calm. They cleaned the wooden decks with salt water and heavy brushes. They checked the ropes every hour. There was a lot of work to do, even when the sea was quiet. Thorne walked to the front of the ship. He pulled the heavy bronze compass from his belt. He looked at the needle. It still pointed straight ahead. He looked at Martha, who was standing near the center of the ship. She was looking at a large piece of paper. It was a chart of the stars. "Is the wind staying with us, Martha?" Thorne asked. Martha looked up and squinted against the bright sun. "Yes, Captain. The wind is coming from the east. It is a good, dry wind. If it stays like this, we will reach the area of the jungle in 2 weeks. But the ocean is large, and our maps of this area are very old." Thorne nodded. He knew the risk. The compass does not care about old maps. It knows exactly where the emerald is. We just need to keep the ship moving. In the evenings, the temperature dropped. The sky turned dark purple, and the stars appeared. There were thousands of them. Without the lights of the city, the stars were very bright. The crew gathered on the deck to eat their dinner of dried meat and hard bread. They sat in small groups. They did not talk loudly. The silence of the ocean was very heavy, and it made people speak in whispers. Arthur, the first mate, sat near a lantern. He was sharpening a small knife. "I have sailed for 30 years. Arthur said to a woman named Clara. Clara was the ship's cook and a strong sailor. "I have seen many things, but I have never gone this far into the blue. It feels like the world is ending over that horizon." "The world does not end, Arthur," Clara replied with a small laugh. "It just gets bigger." Thorne listened to them from the shadows. He felt the weight of his responsibility. He was leading these people into the unknown. If the compass was wrong, they would be lost forever. But when he touched the cold metal of the compass, he felt a strange energy. He knew they were moving toward something important. He looked back at the horizon one last time before going to his cabin. The moon was a thin silver line in the sky. The adventure was only beginning. The 7th day on the ocean was very hot. The sun was a bright circle in the sky, and there was very little wind. The crew of the Black Serpent worked slowly because of the heat. Suddenly, the lookout at the top of the mast shouted. He pointed his arm toward the east. "Something is in the water," he cried. "It is large and white." Captain Thorne grabbed his telescope. He looked through the glass lens. At first, he saw only waves. Then, he saw it. It was a ship. But it did not look right. It was not moving with the wind. It sat low in the water, and its masts were broken. The white color came from the torn sails that hung over the side like old blankets. "Turn the ship," Thorne commanded Martha. "We must see if there are people alive on that boat." The Black Serpent moved slowly toward the mystery ship. As they got closer, the crew became very quiet. The ship was a wreck. Its wooden sides were gray and covered in white salt. There was no flag. There was no name on the front. It looked like a ghost in the middle of the bright blue sea. "It looks very old," Arthur said. He held a thick rope in his hand. "Maybe a storm hit it many weeks ago. Or maybe something else," Martha whispered. She looked at the quiet water around the wreck. Thorne decided to go across. He chose Arthur and 2 other strong sailors to go with him. They lowered a small wooden boat into the water. The sailors used the oars to move toward the wreck. The only noise was the wood of the oars moving against the side of the small boat. They reached the side of the broken ship. Thorne climbed up a loose rope. He stepped onto the deck and looked around. The deck was a mess. There were broken barrels, pieces of glass, and wet clothes everywhere. The wood made a slow, complaining noise under his boots. "Is anyone here?" Thorne shouted. His voice was loud, but only the wind answered him. They walked through the ship. They went down into the dark rooms below the deck. They found the kitchen. There were plates on the table, but the food was gone. They found the sleeping rooms. The beds were empty. There was no blood and no signs of a fight. It was as if everyone simply walked away into the ocean. "The lifeboats are gone," Arthur noted. He pointed to the empty spaces on the side of the ship. "The crew left this ship a long time ago." Thorne walked into the captain's cabin. It was a small room with a large window. On a heavy wooden desk, he saw a small book. It was covered in a piece of blue leather. The pages were wet, but the book was still whole. "We are taking this," Thorne said. He put the book under his arm. "There is nothing else for us here." They left the ghostly wreck and returned to the Black Serpent. As they sailed away, the broken ship looked smaller and smaller. Thorne looked at the blue book in his hand. He hoped the words inside would tell him what happened to the people on that ship. Captain Thorne sat in his cabin. A single lantern hung from the ceiling. The light moved back and forth as the ship sailed over the waves. On the table was the blue leather book from the ghostly wreck. The cover was wet and smelled of salt, but the center of the book was dry. Thorne opened the first page. The writing was difficult to read. The ink was faded, and the handwriting was shaky. It belonged to a man named Captain Miller. Thorne began to read the words aloud to himself. The story in the book started 3 months ago. Captain Miller and his crew were looking for a legendary treasure, just like Thorne. "The compass is working," Miller wrote in the book. "It points toward the green fire. We saw the light last night. It was bright and beautiful." Thorne stopped. "Green fire," he whispered. He looked at the heavy bronze compass on his desk. The needle was still pointing toward the jungle. He realized that the green fire and the emerald of the deep were the same thing. People used different names for the same great prize. Martha entered the cabin. She looked at the book and then at Thorne. "What does it say?" she asked. "Did the captain write about a storm or a battle?" "No," Thorne replied. He turned the pages of the logbook. He wrote about the island. He said the island is not a normal place. He called it the Land of Shadows. Thorne read more. The writing became more messy at the end of the book. Captain Miller wrote about a tall stone tower and a thick jungle. He wrote that the trees seemed to move when no one was looking. The final page was the most frightening. It was written in large, dark letters. "The emerald is a trap." The book said, "We found the green fire, but we cannot leave. The shadows are everywhere. If you find this book, do not follow our path. Turn your ship around and go home." Martha was silent for a minute. She looked at the blue book and then at the dark window. "Do you think they were crazy, Thorne?" "Maybe they were on the ocean for too long. The sun can make a man see things that are not there." "Maybe," Thorne said. He closed the book with a firm hand. The leather made a soft sound against the wood of the table. But their ship was empty. The lifeboats were gone. They were afraid of something. "Are we going back?" Martha asked. She looked into Thorne's eyes. She was a brave woman, but she respected the warnings of other sailors. Thorne stood up. He felt the weight of the compass in his pocket. He thought about the gold, the adventure, and the mystery of the green fire. He was an adult who lived his whole life on the sea. He did not want to go back to a quiet life in the port. "No," Thorne said. "We are not going back. We are going to find the island. We are going to find the emerald. We will be more careful than Captain Miller." Thorne walked to the deck. He looked at the stars. The ocean was quiet, but he knew the island was close. The secrets of the logbook were now in his mind, and he prepared his heart for the dangers ahead. The sky changed color quickly. In the morning, it was a bright blue. By noon, it was a dark, heavy gray. The air became very still and hot. It was difficult to breathe. Captain Thorne stood on the deck and looked at the horizon. He saw a line of black clouds moving toward the Black Serpent. The clouds were very tall and looked like mountains in the sky. "The storm is coming," Thorne shouted. "We must prepare the ship now." The crew moved fast. They knew that a storm on the open ocean was the most dangerous thing a sailor could face. Martha ran to the center of the ship. She helped the sailors pull down the large sails. If the wind was too strong, the sails could break the masts. They tied the white fabric tightly with thick ropes. "Arthur, check the barrels below," Thorne commanded. "Make sure everything is tied down. We do not want the food and water to move around." Arthur and two other men ran below the deck. They used heavy ropes to secure the wooden barrels and the equipment. If a barrel moved, it could break the side of the ship or hurt a sailor. The first part of the storm arrived with a cold wind. It was not a gentle wind. It was a fast, angry wind that pushed the ship to one side. Then, the rain started. It was not a light rain. The water fell from the sky in heavy sheets. It was difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. The world became a place of gray water and dark shadows. "Tie yourselves to the ship," Thorne yelled over the sound of the wind. Every sailor took a piece of rope. They tied one end to their waist and the other end to the heavy wooden rails or the masts. This was the only way to stay safe. If a large wave hit the deck, it could wash a person into the deep, cold ocean. A massive wave rose up in front of the Black Serpent. It looked like a wall of green and white water. The ship went up, up, and up. For a second, it felt like the ship was flying in the air. Then, it went down very fast. The front of the ship hit the water with a very loud noise. A mountain of salt water crashed onto the deck. Thorne held his rope tightly. His hands were cold and wet, but he did not let go. The wind made a high, screaming sound in the ropes. The ship moved left and right. The wood of the ship made deep, groaning noises as it fought the ocean. Martha stayed near the wheel. She was wet from head to toe, but her eyes were focused. She tried to keep the ship straight so the waves did not hit the side. "Hold on," she cried out. The storm continued for hours. The crew was tired and cold, but they did not stop working. They fought for their lives against the power of the sea. Thorne looked into the dark rain. He wondered if Captain Miller's logbook was right. Was the emerald a trap, or was the ocean just testing their strength? The sun rose slowly over the edge of the world. The dark, angry clouds of the night were gone. In their place was a soft, pink sky. The ocean was no longer a mountain of green water. It was flat and quiet, like a large blue mirror. The only movement was the soft rocking of the ship. Captain Thorne opened his eyes. He was lying on the wooden deck. He was very wet and his muscles felt sore. He stood up slowly and looked around. The deck was covered in seaweed and pieces of wet rope. He saw his crew members slowly waking up. They were tired, but they were all alive. "Is everyone okay?" Thorne asked. His voice was a bit dry. "We are alive, Captain," Arthur replied. He was sitting near the main mast. He had a small cut on his forehead, but he was smiling. "The sea tried to take us, but we were too heavy for it." Thorne looked up at the masts. The ship survived the storm, but the sails were in bad condition. The wind last night was so strong that it ripped the heavy fabric. The white sails hung down like old, broken wings. Without the sails, the ship could not move toward the island. "We need to fix these today," Thorne said. "Clara, bring some hot tea for everyone. Arthur, get the large needles and the strong thread. We have a lot of sewing to do." The crew spent the whole morning working under the warm sun. They pulled the heavy, wet sails onto the deck. The sailors sat in a circle. They used large metal needles to sew the holes. It was slow work. Their fingers were tired, and the sun made them thirsty. No one complained. They knew that their lives depended on these sails. Thorne sat with them. He was a captain, but he was also a sailor. He knew how to fix a ship. As he worked, he heard the regular sound of the needles passing through the thick cloth. He heard the quiet talk of the men and women. They talked about their homes and the things they wanted to buy with the emerald gold. Martha walked over to Thorne. She was holding the blue logbook and the bronze compass. She looked at the needle. It was pointing straight ahead. Just like before, the storm did not change our direction. She said, "The compass is still sure. And look at the water. Thorne, do you see the color?" Thorne looked at the sea. Near the ship, the water was a very light blue. He saw a piece of green wood floating in the waves. It was a branch from a tree. "We are very close to land," Thorne said. He felt a new energy in his heart. "The storm pushed us faster than we thought. If we finish these sails by noon, we will see the island before the sun goes down." The crew worked even faster after hearing his words. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the sails were fixed. The sailors pulled the ropes, and the white fabric rose into the air again. The wind caught the sails, and the Black Serpent began to move forward. The journey was almost over. The air changed. It was no longer just the smell of salt and cold water. Now, the wind carried a new scent. It was the smell of wet earth, sweet flowers, and thick green leaves. The lookout at the top of the mast stood up straight. He put his hand over his eyes to block the bright sun. "Land! Land ahead!" he shouted with a big smile. Every sailor on the deck ran to the front of the ship. They looked across the blue water. At first, there was only a small dark line on the horizon. But as the Black Serpent moved closer, the line grew larger and taller. It was a beautiful island. There were high mountains covered in green trees. The tops of the mountains were hidden in white clouds. "Look at the water," Martha said. She stood next to Thorne at the wheel. The water around the island was a different color. It was not deep blue anymore. It was a bright, clear green. It was so clear that Thorne could see the yellow sand and the large gray rocks under the waves. He saw small blue fish swimming quickly near the side of the ship. "Slow the ship down," Thorne commanded. "We do not want to hit a rock." The crew worked together to pull the sails up. The ship moved slowly toward a quiet bay. The beach was perfect. The sand was very white, almost like salt. Tall palm trees grew near the water. Their long leaves moved slowly in the warm wind. Behind the trees, the jungle was dark and thick. It looked like a wall of green. Thorne pulled the bronze compass from his belt. He held it in his hand. The needle was not spinning anymore. It pointed directly at the tallest mountain in the middle of the island. The needle was very still. It was certain. "This is the place," Thorne said. He felt a shiver of excitement on his skin. "The emerald is here." The crew prepared the heavy anchor. The chain moved, and the anchor fell into the clear water. It hit the sandy floor. The ship stayed still in the calm bay. The sailors looked at the beach. Some of them looked happy. but some looked nervous. They remembered the stories from the blue logbook. "Arthur, prepare the small boat." Thorne said, "I want 5 people to come with us. We need to find a place to stay for the night." The sailors lowered the wooden boat into the water. Thorne, Martha, and 3 other adults climbed inside. They used the oars to push the boat through the waves. The wood of the oars made a rhythmic sound. When the boat reached the shallow water, Thorne jumped out. The water was warm against his legs. He helped pull the boat onto the white sand. He stood on the beach and looked at the jungle. It was very quiet. There were no sounds of birds or animals. It was a strange silence. He looked back at his ship, then forward at the dark trees. "We are here," he whispered to himself. He touched the emerald compass. The journey on the sea was over, but the journey through the land of shadows was just beginning. The sun was high in the sky now. It was very hot on the open beach. The white sand was so bright that it hurt the eyes to look at it for too long. Captain Thorne stood near the small boat. He felt the heat of the sun on his back and the warm water of the ocean on his boots. Behind him, the Black Serpent sat quietly in the blue water of the bay. "The air is very heavy here," Martha said. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. She was a strong woman, but even she felt the weight of the tropical heat. "It is the jungle," Thorne replied. He looked at the wall of green trees. "The trees are full of water and life. It makes the air thick." The 3 other sailors, Peter, Sarah, and Thomas, started to move the supplies from the small boat. They carried bags of food, extra water, and sharp tools. They were all experienced adults. Peter was a tall man with many tattoos on his arms. Sarah was a quiet woman who was very good with a map. Thomas was the strongest man on the ship. They stood together on the sand and waited for Thorne's command. Thorne pulled out his compass. The needle was steady. It pointed directly into the shadows of the trees. "We need to find a way inside," he said. "The trees are too thick to walk through. There must be a path." They began to walk along the edge of the jungle. To their left was the beautiful ocean. To their right was the dark forest. They walked for 10 minutes. Suddenly, Martha stopped. She bent down and moved some long, yellow grass with her hands. "Thorne, look at this," she called out. Thorne walked over to her. Under the grass and the sand, there was a large, flat stone. It was gray and very smooth. He kicked more sand away with his boot. He saw another stone, and then another. The stones were placed in a perfect line. They were very old, and green moss grew in the small spaces between them. "A road," Thomas said. He looked surprised. "Someone built a road on this island." "This is not just a road," Thorne said. He followed the line of stones with his eyes. The path started at the edge of the water and went straight into the heart of the jungle. "This is the way to the temple. The people who lived here a long time ago made this for a reason." The stones were large and heavy. It was clear that many people worked together to build this path. The crew felt a bit nervous. A road meant that they were not the first people here. It meant there were secrets hidden in the green shadows. "The stones are solid," Sarah noted. She stepped onto the path. "It is easier to walk here than on the soft sand." Thorne looked at his team. "Stay close together," he warned. "We do not know what is waiting under those trees. Keep your eyes open and your hands on your tools." He stepped onto the first stone. It felt cold under his boots, even in the hot sun. He looked at the dark entrance where the path disappeared into the trees. With the compass in his hand, he led the group away from the bright beach and into the quiet, green world of the island. The group moved slowly into the trees. As soon as they stepped under the green leaves, the world changed. The bright, hot sun of the beach disappeared. Now, the light was dim and green. The air was very wet and smelled like old wood and rain. It was much cooler under the trees, but it was also harder to breathe. The trees are like a roof, Sarah whispered. She looked up at the branches. The leaves were very large, bigger than a person's head. They blocked the sky completely. The stone path continued into the dark. It was not as clean as it was on the beach. Here, the stones were slippery with wet moss and small plants. Large vines, as thick as a man's leg, hung from the trees. Sometimes, the sailors had to use their sharp metal tools to cut the vines so they could pass. Each time a vine was cut, it hit the ground. Thorne led the way. He held the bronze compass in his left hand and a long knife in his right hand. He watched the needle carefully. It pointed straight ahead, but the path started to turn toward the left. We are following the road, but the compass wants us to go toward the mountain, Thorne said. He stopped and looked at the thick wall of trees next to the path. If we leave the path, we will get lost, Martha warned. She stayed close to him. The jungle is too thick. We cannot see the sun or the stars to find our way back. We must stay on the stones. They continued to walk. The only noise was the sound of their boots hitting the stones and the heavy breathing of the men and women. The silence of the jungle was heavy. There were no animals and no birds. It felt like the forest was waiting for something. Suddenly, Peter stopped. He pointed to a large tree on the side of the road. "Look at the bark," he said. Thorne walked closer. On the trunk of the tree, someone carved a sign. It was a drawing of a human eye. The eye was very detailed, and it looked like it was watching the path. The carving was old, but the lines were still deep in the wood. "Is it a warning?" Thomas asked. He held his tool tightly. "Or a guide?" Sarah suggested. "Maybe the people who built the road wanted us to see this." Thorne touched the carving. The wood felt cold and damp. He felt a strange sensation in his chest. He remembered the words from the blue logbook. "The shadows are everywhere." He looked back at his crew. They all looked tired and a bit afraid. "We keep going," Thorne said firmly. "We are adults and we are brave. A drawing in a tree cannot hurt us." They walked for another hour. The path began to go up a hill. The stones were steeper now, and the sailors had to move carefully so they did not fall. Finally, the trees opened up a little bit. In the distance, through the leaves, they saw something gray and very tall. It was not a tree. It was made of stone. "There," Thorne said, pointing his knife. "The landmark." They moved faster now. They wanted to reach the open space before the light disappeared. The mystery of the island was slowly opening before them. The group reached a wide clearing. The trees stopped at the edge of a large circle of flat ground. In the center of the circle stood the object they saw from the hill. It was a giant statue made of gray stone. It was much taller than a tall man. In fact, it was as high as the masts of the Black Serpent. The statue was covered in thick, green moss. Small flowers grew out of the cracks in the stone. Despite the plants, the shape of the statue was clear. It was the head of a man. His eyes were closed, and his face looked very calm. He had a long beard made of stone that reached down to the ground. "It is beautiful," Sarah whispered. She walked toward the statue and touched the moss. It was soft and wet. "I have never seen anything like this in the city. The stone is very old, but the work is very detailed." Thorne stood at the base of the statue. He looked up at the closed eyes. He felt a sense of history. Many hundreds of years ago, people lived here. They built the stone road, and they carved this face. Why did they do it? Who was this man? He looked like a king or a god of the ocean. "Captain, look at the forehead," Martha said. She pointed to a spot above the statue's eyes. Thorne stepped back to see better. On the forehead of the stone man, there was a large carving. It was not a drawing of an eye or a person. It was a map of the stars. There were many small circles connected by thin lines. Thorne quickly pulled the bronze compass from his leather bag. He held it up next to the statue. "The drawings are the same," Thorne said. His heart beat faster. The stars on the compass match the stars on the statue exactly. They are identical. He looked at the base of the statue. Around the neck of the stone man, there were more carvings. These carvings looked like waves of water. The compass in his hand felt warm. The needle was not just pointing at the mountain anymore. It was shaking slightly. It was as if the metal tool was talking to the ancient stone. "Does this mean the emerald is inside the statue?" Thomas asked. He walked around the back of the head, looking for a door or a hidden hole. "No," Thorne said. He looked at the compass and then at the tall mountain in the distance. "This statue is a guide. It is a sign that we are on the right path. The people who made the emerald wanted travelers to find this face first. It tells us we are not lost." Martha looked at the sky. The light was starting to change from a dim green to a dark purple. "The sun is going down. Thorne, we cannot stay here in the open. We should make a camp near the statue. The stone will protect us from the wind." The crew began to unpack their bags. They were tired, but the sight of the statue gave them hope. They were not just walking into a dark forest. They were following a plan. Thorne sat near the stone feet of the giant. He watched the shadows grow long across the clearing. He knew the journey was becoming more than just a hunt for gold. It was a mystery, and they were finally finding the first pieces. Thorne woke up early. The sun was not yet high in the sky. The jungle was very cold and wet. He stood up and stretched his muscles. The giant stone statue looked even bigger in the gray morning light. He looked at his crew. They were still sleeping on their blankets. Martha was awake, too. She was checking the supplies and looking at her maps. "I'm going to climb that ridge," Thorne said to Martha. He pointed to a high, rocky hill near the clearing. "I want to see our ship and the bay one more time." Martha nodded. "Be careful, Captain. The rocks are wet from the morning rain." Thorne climbed the hill. It was difficult work. He used his strong hands to pull himself up the grey stones. His boots slipped a few times, but he was a strong man. When he reached the top, he had a clear view of the blue ocean. He saw the Black Serpent. It looked very small from this height. It sat quietly in the calm water of the bay. Then, he looked further out into the deep sea. His heart felt cold. There was another ship on the horizon. It was much larger than his ship. It had 3 tall masts and very dark sails. Thorne knew those black sails very well. It was the Shadow, the ship of Captain Silas. Silas was a very bad man. He was a pirate who did not follow any rules. He liked to steal from other captains, and he was famous for his cruelty. He was 40 years old, and he had a large crew of violent men. Thorne and Silas were enemies for a long time. "No," Thorne whispered to the wind. "How did he find us?" He watched the black ship for a few minutes. It was moving slowly but surely toward the island. It was entering the same bay. Silas was not far behind them. He probably saw the same storm or found another map in a different port. Thorne ran back down the hill. He moved very fast. He almost fell once, but he caught a thick tree branch. He reached the clearing and spoke to his crew. "Wake up. Everyone, get your bags now." Thorne shouted. "What is happening, Captain?" Peter asked. He was still half asleep and rubbing his eyes. "Silas is here," Thorne said. The crew became very silent. The name of Silas was like a curse. They all knew that Silas did not want to share the emerald. He wanted to take it for himself. He was the kind of man who killed everyone to keep a secret. Martha looked at the dark jungle path. If he is at the beach, he will find the stone road soon. He will see the small boat we left on the sand. "We must move faster," Thorne said. He pulled the heavy compass from his belt. The needle was still pointing toward the mountain. "We cannot stay here. We need to reach the entrance to the mountain before Silas and his men find this statue." The crew packed their things in a great hurry. They did not have time to eat a morning meal. They left the quiet stone statue and moved back into the dark, thick trees. The adventure was now a dangerous race. The crew moved through the jungle with great speed. They did not stop to rest. The fear of Captain Silas was stronger than their tired legs. Thorne led the way, cutting through the thick green walls of the forest. Every time he heard a branch move behind them, he looked back. He expected to see the cold eyes of Silas and his men. But for now, the jungle was still quiet. The path became very steep. The ground was no longer soft earth. It was hard, grey rock. They were climbing the base of the mountain. The air grew cooler as they went higher, but the humidity was still very high. Thorne wiped the sweat from his eyes. He looked at the compass. The needle was pointing directly at a high wall of rock. "The compass says the way is through the mountain," Thorne said. He looked at the solid wall of stone. "But I do not see a door or a cave." "Listen," Martha said. She held up her hand. The crew became very quiet. From somewhere ahead, they heard a deep, constant noise. It was the sound of falling water. They walked around a large group of trees and stopped. Before them was a beautiful sight. A tall, thin waterfall fell from a high cliff. The water was a bright, clear blue. It hit a small pool at the bottom. The mist from the water felt cold and fresh on their skin. "It is a dead end," Thomas said. He looked at the high cliff and the water. "We cannot climb this, and there is no path around it." Martha did not agree. She walked closer to the pool. She watched how the water fell against the rock. She noticed that the cliff behind the waterfall was not flat. There was a dark space behind the blue curtain of water. "Follow me," Martha said. She stepped into the shallow pool. The water reached her knees. She moved carefully over the wet stones and walked directly toward the falling water. "Martha, wait," Thorne called out. But Martha did not stop. She pushed her body through the heavy, falling water and disappeared. A moment later, her head popped back out. She was completely wet, but she had a big smile on her face. "Come inside," she shouted over the noise of the waterfall. "There is a large space here." Thorne and the rest of the crew followed her. One by one, they stepped through the cold, blue water. Behind the waterfall, the air was dark and smelled like wet stone. It was a large, natural room. The light from the outside came through the water, making the cave glow with a soft blue light. At the back of the cave, Thorne saw something incredible. It was a large door made of white stone. It was perfectly square and very smooth. In the center of the door, there was a carving. It was the same star map they saw on the statue and the compass. "You found it, Martha," Thorne said. He touched the cold white stone. "This is the entrance to the heart of the mountain." "How do we open it?" Sarah asked. She looked for a handle or a keyhole, but the door was perfectly flat. Thorne pulled the bronze compass from his belt. As he brought the compass near the door, the metal began to glow with a faint green light. The stone door made a deep, grinding noise. It did not open outward. It began to slide slowly into the floor. "Get inside," Thorne commanded. "Silas will be here soon. We must close the door behind us." The white stone door finished its movement and the room became completely dark. The only sound was the water falling outside the cave. Now, that sound was very quiet. Thorne stood still. He could not see his own hands. He heard the heavy breathing of his crew. The air inside was still and very dry. "Is everyone okay?" Thorne asked. His voice was deep and it echoed off the cold walls. "Yes, Captain," Martha answered from the darkness. "But we need light. It is very hard to see in here." Thorne reached into his bag. He pulled out a small piece of wood covered in oil. He used a stone and a piece of metal to create a spark. A small yellow flame appeared. He touched the flame to the wood, and soon he had a bright torch. The fire moved in the air, creating long shadows. He handed it to Thomas, the strongest sailor. Then Thorne lit another torch for himself and one for Sarah. The yellow light of the torches pushed the shadows back. They were standing in a long, narrow tunnel. The walls were made of smooth grey stone. The floor was perfectly flat. It was clear that this was not a natural cave. People built this place with tools and a plan a long time ago. "Look at the walls," Sarah said. She held her torch close to the stone. There were more carvings on the walls. These were different from the star maps. They showed people in long robes. Some people were carrying large boxes on their shoulders. Others were looking at the moon and the sun. The carvings were very detailed. You could see the expressions on the faces of the stone people. "These are the people who lived here," Martha said quietly. "They look like they are in a parade. They look happy." "A parade for the emerald," Thorne added. He looked at the tunnel ahead. It went deep into the heart of the mountain. It looked like a long, dark throat. The air in the tunnel was very cold. Each time the sailors breathed, a small cloud of white vapor appeared in the air. The warm smell of the jungle was gone. Now, the air smelled like old dust and cold metal. It was a lonely smell. "Do you think Silas found the waterfall yet?" Peter asked. His voice was a bit shaky. He looked back at the closed white door. "He is a smart man, Peter," Thorne replied. "He will find the cave eventually. But he does not have the compass. He cannot open the door as we did. We have time, but we must not waste it." They began to walk. Their boots made a rhythmic noise on the stone floor. The light from their torches moved across the carvings as they passed. The tunnel did not have any windows. There was no way to know if it was day or night in the world outside. As they walked deeper, the tunnel became wider. They saw many smaller paths on the left and the right. Some paths went up, and some went down. It was like a giant stone puzzle. "Which way, Thorne?" Martha asked. She stopped and looked at the different openings. Thorne pulled out the bronze compass. The needle was glowing with a soft, green light. It did not point to the side paths. It pointed to the largest path in the center. "We follow the light," Thorne said firmly. The crew walked in a line. They were alone in the dark heart of the mountain. They were far from the sea, and the weight of the mountain was above them. Thorne felt the heavy responsibility on his shoulders. He had to find the treasure and keep his friends safe from the shadows of the past. The tunnel finally opened into a very large room. The ceiling was so high that the light from the torches could not reach the top. Thorne, Martha, and the crew stood at the entrance. They held their torches high. The light danced on the floor in front of them. The floor was not made of smooth stone anymore. Instead, it was made of hundreds of small, square stones. Each stone had a symbol carved into it. Thorne saw drawings of the sun, the moon, the stars, and small fish. It looked like a giant stone carpet. "Wait," Martha said. Her voice was a sharp whisper. She held out her arm to stop the group. "Look at the dust on the floor." Thorne looked closely. The dust on the stones was not equal. Some stones were clean, and some were covered in thick grey dust. He picked up a small, heavy rock from the ground and threw it onto a stone with a sun symbol. As soon as the rock hit the stone, a loud, grinding noise filled the room. The square stone did not stay in place. It moved down very quickly. It disappeared into a dark hole. The group waited. A long time later, a very quiet noise came from the deep darkness below. The stone was gone. "A trap," Thomas said. His face was pale in the torchlight. "If we step on the wrong stone, we fall into the mountain. But some stones must be safe," Sarah said. She pointed to a line of stones with star symbols. The people who lived here had to walk across this room to reach the other side. Thorne pulled out the bronze compass. The green light from the tool was very bright now. He held it over the floor. The green light moved across the stones. When the light touched a stone with a star symbol, the light stayed steady. When it touched a moon symbol, the light flickered and almost went out. "The stars," Thorne said. "The compass is showing us the path. We must only step on the stars." Thorne took the first step. He was a brave man, but his leg was shaking a little. He placed his heavy boot on a star stone. He waited. The stone stayed still. It felt solid and safe. He took another step to the next star. One by one, the crew followed him in a straight line. They moved very slowly. It was like a slow dance in the dark. No one spoke. The only sound was the breathing of the sailors and the soft movement of their clothes. They were halfway across the room when a loud, metallic scraping noise echoed from the walls. "Don't move," Thorne commanded. The walls of the room began to move closer. It was a slow movement, but it was steady. The space was becoming smaller every second. "We must run," Martha cried. "But stay on the stars." The crew moved faster now. They jumped from star to star. Peter almost slipped on a wet edge, but Thomas caught his arm and pulled him up. They reached the other side of the room just as the walls stopped moving. There was a large wooden door at the end of the path. They pushed the door open and ran through. They stood in a new, quiet hallway and looked back. The room with the moving floor was silent again. The danger was behind them, but Thorne knew the mountain had many more secrets to hide. The wooden door closed behind them. For a moment, the crew stood in a small, dark hallway. They were all breathing very fast. Their hearts were beating like drums after the danger of the moving floor. Thorne held his torch high. He saw another door at the end of the hall. This door was not made of wood or stone. It was made of bright, yellow metal. "Is that gold?" Peter asked. His eyes were very wide. Thorne walked to the door and touched it. It was cool and very smooth. "It is gold," he said. He pushed the door. It was heavy, but it opened easily on its quiet metal hinges. As the door opened, the crew stopped. They could not believe their eyes. They were standing in a giant room. The room was full of gold. There were huge piles of gold coins on the floor. There were gold plates, gold cups, and tall gold statues of kings and queens. The light from their torches reflected off the metal. The whole room looked like it was on fire with a bright, yellow light. "We are rich," Thomas whispered. He walked to a pile of coins and picked one up. The sound of metal hitting metal was loud in the quiet room. "We can buy 10 ships with this. We can buy a whole city." Peter and Sarah ran to the piles of treasure. They laughed and ran their hands through the gold. The coins made a sliding, metallic noise as they moved. Even Martha looked surprised. She looked at a gold necklace covered in small white pearls. "Stay focused," Thorne shouted. His voice was loud and firm. The sailors stopped and looked at their captain. Thorne was not looking at the gold coins. He was not looking at the statues. He was looking at the bronze compass in his hand. The needle was not pointing at the gold. It was pointing toward a dark archway at the back of the room. The green light of the compass was still strong, but it did not react to the yellow metal. "The emerald is not here," Thorne said. "This gold is just a distraction. It is here to make people stop. If you take this gold now, you will be too heavy to run. You will be too slow to escape Silas." "But Captain," Peter said, holding a handful of coins, "this is what we came for, isn't it? We came for the Emerald of the Deep." Thorne replied. He walked toward the back of the room. "The gold is beautiful, but it does not have the power of the stone. We do not know what traps are still ahead. Put the coins back." The sailors were sad, but they listened to their captain. They knew Thorne was a wise man. They put the gold back on the piles. Thomas dropped a gold plate, and it made a ringing noise as it hit the floor. They walked through the Hall of Gold. It was difficult to walk past so much wealth, but they followed the green light of the compass. As they reached the dark archway, Thorne looked back one last time. The gold was beautiful, but he felt a strange coldness in the air. This room was a test, and he was glad his crew passed it. "The real treasure is still ahead," Thorne said. They stepped out of the golden light and back into the dark, cold stone tunnels. The air felt even colder now. After the warm, yellow glow of the gold room, the dark hallway felt like ice. Thorne, Martha, and the others walked quietly. Their torches were the only source of light. They stopped when the hallway opened into a long, wide room. This room did not have gold or traps. Instead, the walls were covered from the floor to the ceiling with carvings and colorful paintings. "Wait," Sarah said. She held her torch close to the left wall. Sarah was not just a sailor. She was a woman who studied ancient books and history. Her eyes moved quickly over the drawings. "This is not just art. This is a story. It is the history of the island." Thorne and Martha walked over to her. The first painting showed a great storm at sea, but the waves were made of green light, not blue water. In the center of the green storm, a bright stone fell from the sky into the ocean. "The heart of the sea," Sarah whispered. She moved to the next painting. It showed the people of the island finding the stone on the beach. They looked happy. They built the stone road and the giant statue Thorne and his crew saw in the jungle. They thought the stone was a gift. Sarah explained. She pointed to a drawing of the Emerald of the Deep sitting on a tall stone table. Around the stone, the plants were huge and the fish were plentiful. The emerald gave life to the island. It made the trees grow fast and kept the water clean. However, as they moved further down the wall, the colors changed. The bright greens and blues became dark purples and blacks. The paintings showed a man with a greedy face trying to steal the stone. When he touched it, the sky turned black. The people in the drawings looked afraid. They were running away from long, dark shadows that came out of the ground. The logbook was right, Martha said. She looked at a drawing of a ship sinking in a dark whirlpool. The stone is a protector, but it is also a guard. If someone with a bad heart tries to take it, the island turns against them. What happened to the people? Thomas asked. He looked at the final painting. It showed the island empty. The stone road was covered in moss, and the great statue was alone. They left, Sarah said. They realized they could not control the power of the heart. They hid it deep inside this mountain and built the traps to keep greedy people away. They hoped the shadows would sleep if the stone remained in the dark. Thorne looked at his bronze compass. The needle was vibrating now. It made a very soft humming sound that Thorne could feel in his hand. He looked at the final carving on the wall. It was a map of the mountain itself. It showed a secret path that went down, deep under the earth, to a hidden lake. "We are close," Thorne said. "The emerald is at the center of the mountain, under the water. But we must be careful. We are not the only ones here, and we know the island can wake up." Just then, Thorne heard a faint noise from the hallway behind them. It was the sound of many boots hitting the stone floor. It was far away, but it was coming closer. "Silas," Martha whispered. "We must move," Thorne said. "If he finds these paintings, he will know where the stone is. We have to reach the lake first." The sound of the boots became very loud. Thorne looked back at the entrance to the Hall of History. He saw the orange light of many torches. Then, a man walked into the room. He was tall and wore a long black coat. He had a cold smile and a dark beard. It was Captain Silas. Behind him were 10 of his strongest men. They all had sharp swords and heavy pistols in their hands. Well, Thorne," Silas said. His voice was slow and mean. "You did all the hard work for me. You found the path. You opened the doors. And you even found this beautiful history lesson." Thorne stepped in front of his crew. He held his own sword tightly. His knuckles were white. "The journey is over for you, Silas. This island is dangerous. You saw the paintings on the walls. The stone is not for men like you." Silas laughed. It was a dry, cold sound that echoed through the room. He did not look at the paintings. He only looked at the bronze compass in Thorne's hand. "I do not care about stories or old drawings, Thorne. I care about gold and power. And that emerald will make me the king of the ocean. Give it to me now." "You cannot have it," Martha said. She stood next to Thorne, holding a long wooden staff. She did not look afraid. Silas looked at his men. "They are only 5 people. We are many. Take the compass and the girl." The pirates moved forward. Thorne's crew stood in a circle. They were ready to fight, but they knew they were in a bad position. The Hall of History was a large room, but it had only one exit, and Silas was blocking it. The pirates were closing in. "Wait!" Sarah shouted. She was looking at the carvings on the far wall. "There is another way." "Thorne, the map on the wall shows a hidden lever near the statue." Thorne looked at the wall. He saw a small stone shaped like a fish. He ran to it and pulled it down with all his strength. The stone was heavy, but it moved. A deep, grinding noise filled the room. A heavy stone gate began to fall from the ceiling. It was falling between Thorne's crew and Silas's men. "Stop them!" Silas yelled. He ran forward with his sword raised. The pirates tried to reach Thorne, but they were too slow. The heavy gate hit the floor with a massive force. It shook the ground. The gate blocked the hallway completely. Silas and his men were on one side, and Thorne's crew was on the other. Thorne breathed a sigh of relief, but then he looked around. The room they were in now was very small and dark. There were no other visible doors. The gate was closed, and there was no handle to open it from this side. Silas was trapped outside, but Thorne and his crew were trapped inside a stone box. "We are in a cage," Thomas said. He touched the cold, rough stone of the gate. Thorne looked at the compass. The green light was still there, but the room was completely silent. They were safe from Silas for now, but they were stuck in the dark heart of the mountain. He needed to find a way out before they ran out of air or light. The room was very small. The air felt thin and dry. Thorne held his torch toward the walls, searching for a way out. He soon realized they were not alone. On the other side of a small crack in the rock, he saw the flickering light of another torch. Silas's men were not going to wait at the main gate. They had found a narrow side tunnel that led into this very chamber. "They are coming through the gap," Martha shouted. She raised her wooden staff, her eyes sharp and ready. A pirate with a red scarf pushed his head and shoulders through a hole in the stone wall. He held a long knife between his teeth. Thorne did not wait for the man to climb inside. He ran forward with his sword raised. He used the heavy metal hilt of his sword to push the man back. The pirate fell away into the darkness of the side tunnel. Soon, more men appeared at the opening. The small room became a place of fast movement and long shadows. The yellow light from the torches jumped wildly on the walls. Thorne fought a tall pirate near the center of the room. Their swords met with a heavy, metallic force. Thorne could see the pirate's angry eyes. The man was much younger than Thorne, but Thorne was more experienced. He used his weight and his shoulder to push the man hard against the cold stone wall. "Stay together," Thorne yelled to his crew. "Do not let them get behind you." Martha was a blur of movement. She was very fast with her staff. She hit a pirate on the arm, and his sword fell to the floor. Thomas used his great strength to push two other men back toward the hole. Sarah held a torch in one hand to provide light and a small knife in the other. She stayed near the supplies, making sure the pirates did not take their food or water. The fight was difficult because of the darkness. Sometimes, Thorne could only see the shadow of an arm or the flash of a blade. The air was full of the smell of sweat and torch smoke. The pirates were loud and angry. They wanted the compass, and they were willing to kill for it. "The compass, Thorne. Give it to me," a voice shouted from the other side of the hole. It was Silas, watching his men from the safety of the tunnel. Thorne did not answer. He looked at the bronze compass on his belt. It was glowing very brightly now. The green light was pointing at the floor, near the back wall. He saw a small wooden hatch hidden under a pile of old stones and dust. "In here. I found a path," Thorne called to his crew. He kicked the stones away and pulled the iron handle. The hatch opened with a slow, heavy movement. It led to a set of steep stone stairs going down into the mountain. "Go! Go now!" Thorne commanded. Martha jumped into the hole first. Then came Sarah and Peter. Thomas stayed with Thorne to hold the line against the pirates. They fought back the last two men who tried to enter. Then, Thorne pushed Thomas toward the hatch. "Your turn, Captain," Thomas said, breathing hard. Thorne took one last look at the angry faces of the pirates. He dropped his burning torch near the opening to blind the enemies for a moment. Then, he jumped into the dark opening and pulled the hatch shut. He heard the pirates hitting the wood above, but he was already moving down the stairs into the deep, quiet dark. Thorne followed his crew down the narrow stairs. The air was very cold and smelled like wet earth. The wooden hatch above them was closed. He could hear the pirates above. They were hitting the wood with their heavy tools. The noise was dull because of the thick stone, but it was still there. Thorne knew the wood would not stay strong forever. "Keep moving," he whispered. His voice was soft, but the others heard him in the quiet space. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a new tunnel. This tunnel was much smaller than the others. The ceiling was very low. Thomas, the strongest man, had to bend his head to walk. The walls were rough and wet. Water dripped from the ceiling, making a steady, rhythmic noise on the stone floor. Martha held a small lantern. Its yellow light was weak in the thick darkness. "The mountain feels very heavy above us," she said. She looked at the walls. They were not smooth or carved like the rooms above. This part of the mountain was natural and very ancient. Thorne pulled the bronze compass from his belt. The green light was bright. It cut through the dark like a small, magical star. The needle moved toward a wall at the very end of the tunnel. When they reached the wall, the group stopped. "It is a dead end," Peter said. He touched the cold, solid rock with his hand. He looked very tired, and his face was covered in grey dust. "We are trapped again, Captain." Thorne did not believe it. He knew the compass was never wrong. He held the green light close to the floor. He saw a small hole in the corner of the wall. It was not a door. It was a jagged opening in the stone. It looked very small, but it was the only way to continue their journey. "Look here," Thorne said. He pointed to the hole. "We can get through this." He went first. He had to lie down on his stomach. He crawled through the small space slowly. The rock was sharp and cold against his chest. It was difficult to breathe because the space was so tight and the air was old. For a moment, he felt the mountain pressing against him. Then, his hands felt empty air. He pushed himself forward and stood up in a larger space. "It is okay," he called back to the others. His voice echoed. "You can come through. It is safe." One by one, the crew crawled through the hole. Thomas had the most difficult time because he was a very large man, but Martha and Sarah pulled his arms from the other side. Finally, all 5 adults were together again in the new tunnel. This tunnel was different. It went down at a very steep angle. The floor was slippery and covered in wet mud. Thorne looked at the compass. The needle was pointing even deeper into the earth. They were now far away from the pirates and far away from the light of the sun. "We are going to the very bottom of the mountain," Thorne said. He felt a mix of fear and excitement in his heart. The heart of the sea is very close now. The steep tunnel finally became flat. The crew stepped out of the narrow space and onto a wide stone ledge. Thorne held his torch high, but the light did not reach the walls or the ceiling. They were in a cavern so large that it felt like they were standing outside under a midnight sky. Below the ledge, there was a vast, underground lake. The water was perfectly still and as black as ink. It looked like a giant piece of dark glass. There were no waves and no wind. The only movement came from small drops of water falling from the high ceiling. Each drop hit the surface of the lake, creating slow, circular ripples that moved across the dark water. "It is beautiful," Sarah whispered. She stood at the edge of the ledge. "But it is very deep. I cannot see the bottom, even with the torch." Thorne pulled out the bronze compass. The green light was now a bright, steady glow. It did not point to the left or the right. It pointed directly across the center of the lake. In the far distance, Thorne saw a tiny, flickering green light. It was like a small star reflecting on the water. "That is our goal," Thorne said. He pointed to the distant light. "The heart of the sea is on the other side of this water." "But how do we get there?" Thomas asked. He looked at the black water. "The lake is too wide to swim. The water is probably very cold, and we are carrying heavy bags." Martha walked along the ledge, looking at the ground. She moved her torch near the wall. "Look here," she said. "The people who lived here did not swim. They were sailors, just like us." Near the wall, there were several large wooden poles stuck into the stone. Next to the poles, hidden under a layer of white dust, was a flat wooden structure. It was a large raft made of thick, dark wood. The wood was very old, but it was dry and strong. "Help me move this," Thorne commanded. The 4 men and women grabbed the edges of the raft. They pushed it toward the water. It was very heavy. Finally, the raft reached the edge. With one final push, it hit the surface of the lake. It did not sink. It floated perfectly on the black water. "There are oars here, too," Peter said. He pulled 2 long pieces of wood from behind a rock. Thorne stepped onto the raft first. It moved a little, but it stayed stable. One by one, the rest of the crew climbed on. They sat in a circle, holding their torches. The light from the fire and the compass reflected off the water, making the cavern look like a dream. "Start rowing," Thorne said. Thomas and Peter took the oars. They pushed the wood into the water. The water was very heavy and cold. As the raft moved away from the ledge, the silence of the cavern returned. They were now in the middle of the lake, far from any shore. Thorne watched the green light ahead. He felt the mountain all around them, but his heart was focused on the treasure that waited in the dark. The raft moved slowly across the silent water. The only sound was the rhythmic movement of the oars. Thomas and Peter worked with steady arms, their faces glistening with sweat in the torchlight. As they moved further from the shore, the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, but the green glow ahead grew larger and more brilliant. "Look down," Martha whispered, pointing over the side of the raft. Thorne looked. Beneath the surface of the black water, he saw faint, pulsing veins of light. They were like underwater lightning, branching out through the depths of the lake. Small, translucent fish followed the raft, their bodies glowing with a soft, bioluminescent hum. It was as if the water itself was alive with the energy of the mountain. "The emerald is feeding the island," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "This isn't just a stone, it's a heart. The paintings were right. It's the source of everything." As they drew closer, a small island began to emerge from the darkness. It was not made of rough rock like the rest of the cavern. Instead, it was a perfectly circular platform of white marble, rising just a few feet above the water. In the center of the platform stood a tall, slender pillar of obsidian, black, volcanic glass that reflected the green light like a mirror. Atop the pillar sat the prize. The emerald of the deep was larger than a man's fist. It was shaped like a teardrop and glowed with an intense, rhythmic light that seemed to breathe. Every few seconds, a wave of emerald energy pulsed outward, illuminating the entire cavern and making the shadows dance. Thorne stepped off the raft onto the white marble. The stone felt warm beneath his boots. He approached the pillar slowly, his hand reaching for the compass in his pocket. The bronze tool was vibrating so hard it felt like a living bird trapped in his hand. "It's beautiful," Peter said, stepping onto the platform behind him. "Think of the power, Thorne. Think of what we could do with this." "We must be careful," Thorne cautioned. He noticed small inscriptions at the base of the obsidian pillar. They were written in a language he couldn't read, but the meaning was clear. There were drawings of a hand reaching for the stone and the sky turning black. The warning from the Hall of History is still true. This stone is a protector, but it is also a guard. Thorne stood before the emerald. The green light washed over his face, turning his skin a strange, ethereal color. He felt a deep pull in his chest, a sense of destiny mixed with a heavy weight of responsibility. He wasn't just a treasure hunter anymore. He was standing at the center of the world's greatest mystery. "Do we take it?" Thomas asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. Thorne looked back at his crew. They were all adults who had faced storms, pirates, and the dark mountain together. He saw hope in their eyes, but he also saw fear. "If we take it, the light might go out," Thorne said quietly. "But if we leave it, Silas will surely find it. And a man like Silas will use this power for nothing but blood and greed." He reached out his hand, his fingers inches away from the cold, glowing surface of the emerald. Just as his skin was about to touch the stone, a loud, booming crash echoed from a distance. The sound of the white stone door at the waterfall finally being forced open. The booming sound echoed across the silent lake like a giant's footsteps. It wasn't just the door. It was the mountain itself groaning. Silas and his men had finally broken through. On the distant ledge, Thorne saw the orange flickers of their torches appearing. "Thorne, I know you're out there," Silas's voice was a jagged blade in the quiet air. "You can't hide in the dark forever." Thorne looked at the emerald of the deep. His fingers brushed the cold, smooth surface. The moment he made contact, a shock of energy surged up his arm. It wasn't painful, but it was ancient. He felt the weight of the sea, the depth of the earth, and the pulse of the jungle all at once. "Captain, they're preparing their own boats." Martha pointed toward the ledge. Silas's men were uncovering smaller, hidden rafts along the shore. Thorne made his decision. He gripped the teardrop-shaped stone and pulled. It didn't resist. It came away from the obsidian pillar with a soft click, like a key turning in a lock. Immediately, the rhythm of the cavern changed. The soft green glow of the lake's veins flickered and died. The bioluminescent fish vanished into the depths. The only light left was the intense, angry green fire radiating from the stone in Thorne's hand. "The shadows," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. From the dark corners of the ceiling and the edges of the water, something started to move. They weren't people, and they weren't animals. They were patches of absolute darkness, darker than the cave itself, drifting like smoke across the surface of the lake. They were the guardians the logbook had warned about. "To the raft. Now!" Thorne commanded. The crew scrambled back onto the wooden structure. Thomas and Peter dug the oars into the water with desperate strength. The raft lurched forward, but the black smoke-like shadows were faster. They drifted towards Silas's men first, who had just launched their rafts. A scream rang out across the water as the first shadow touched a pirate. "Row! Row for your lives!" Thorne yelled, holding the emerald high. Its light seemed to act as a shield, pushing back the shadows that tried to approach their raft. The lake, once a mirror of peace, was now a whirlpool of chaos. Thorne looked toward the exit tunnel, but it was far away. Silas was between them and the path out. The pirate captain stood on his raft, his sword drawn, his eyes fixed on the green fire in Thorne's hand, oblivious to the shadows swirling around his own men. The two rafts collided. The impact nearly threw Martha into the freezing black water, but Thomas caught her arm. Silas leaped from his raft before the wood had even stopped. He landed on Thorne's raft with the grace of a predator, his dark coat billowing like the wings of a crow. "Give it to me, Thorne!" Silas roared, swinging his heavy cutlass. Thorne parried the blow with his sword, the metal sparks flying into the dark. In his other hand, he held the emerald of the deep high. The stone was no longer just glowing. It was vibrating with a low, humming frequency that made Thorne's teeth ache. "You don't understand, Silas!" Thorne shouted over the screams of the pirates and the whispering of the shadows. "The stone is the only thing keeping those things back. If you take it, we all die in the dark." Silas didn't care. His eyes were fixed on the green fire. He swung again, a desperate, wild strike. Thorne dodged, but the movement caused him to stumble. The emerald slipped from his grip, rolling across the wet wood of the raft. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The protective shield of green light vanished as the stone rolled away. The shadows, sensing the opening, rushed in like a tide of black ink. They swirled around the edges of the raft, cold and suffocating. Silas dived for the stone, but as his fingers touched the emerald, he didn't feel the warmth Thorne had felt. He screamed. The stone flared with an angry, white-hot light, rejecting him. Silas's hand was thrown back as if he had touched a lightning bolt. Thorne scrambled across the deck and grabbed the stone. As soon as his palm closed over it, the light returned, soft and steady. The shadows recoiled, hissing like steam on hot iron. "Martha!" "The exit!" Thorne pointed toward the far wall of the cavern. The emerald's light was now acting like a lighthouse. It revealed something they hadn't seen before, a thin crack in the stone wall, hidden behind a curtain of falling mist. It wasn't a tunnel they could row through, but a narrow opening high above the water level. "We have to jump for it," Martha yelled, grabbing a rope. "The pirates are everywhere." Thomas pointed to the other rafts, where Silas's men were trying to recover from the shadow attacks. "They won't follow us into the light," Thorne said. He looked at Silas, who was clutching his burned hand, his face a mask of pure hatred. "This is over, Silas. The island has chosen." Thorne kicked the oars toward Thomas. "Row for the crack. Now." The raft surged forward. As they neared the wall, Thorne saw a series of small stone ledges leading up to the opening. It would be a difficult climb, but it was their only hope. The shadows were gathering again, sensing the stone was moving further away from the heart of the mountain. The very earth began to shake, as if the mountain was tired of the intruders. The raft struck the jagged stone base of the cliff with a violent jolt. Wood splintered, and the platform began to take on the dark, icy water of the lake. Thorne didn't wait. He leaped onto the first moss-covered ledge, his boots finding purchase on the ancient rock. Above him, the crack in the mountain wall glowed with a faint, natural light, the first sign of the world outside. "Move. Don't look back." Thorne reached down and hauled Martha up beside him. The mountain was no longer merely groaning. It was screaming. Stones the size of barrels plummeted from the ceiling, crashing into the water where Silas's pirates were still struggling. The shadows had fully descended now, a swirling vortex of cold darkness that seemed to be pulling the very heat out of the air. Silas was nowhere to be seen, lost in the black mist of his own greed. Thomas and Peter scrambled up the ledges, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Sarah followed, her fingers bleeding from the sharp edges of the obsidian. But she didn't slow down. The emerald of the deep, tucked into Thorne's belt, pulsed with a rhythmic green light that guided their hands and feet. It was as if the stone wanted to be free of the dark just as much as they did. "The ledge is narrowing," Sarah cried out, pointing ahead. The path upward became a thin ribbon of stone, barely wide enough for a single person. Below them, the underground lake was a scene from a nightmare. The water was churning, and the shadows were rising like a solid wall. Thorne felt the emerald grow warm against his side. He pulled it out and held it toward the darkness. "Not today," he growled. The emerald emitted a blinding flash of pure, sunlight green energy. The shadows recoiled, shrieking in a frequency that felt like glass breaking in the ears. For a moment, the path was clear. They reached the crack. It was a narrow, vertical split in the mountain, barely wide enough for Thomas's broad shoulders. Thorne pushed through first, feeling the rough stone scrape against his arms. The air changed instantly. The heavy, stagnant smell of the cave was replaced by the sharp, invigorating scent of salt spray and tropical rain. They emerged onto a high, hidden balcony overlooking the sea. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. Far below, the white sand of the beach looked like a peaceful dream. The Black Serpent was still there, anchored in the bay, a tiny toy on a vast blue carpet. "We made it," Peter whispered, collapsing against the cliff face. "We're not home yet," Thorne said, looking at the emerald. It was calm now, its light steady and soft. But the mountain has given up its heart. Behind them, the entrance to the cave collapsed with a final, definitive roar. The land of shadows was sealed away once more, leaving only the 5 of them on the heights, the wind in their hair and the greatest treasure in history in their hands. The descent from the balcony was easier than the climb through the dark. With the emerald of the deep safely tucked away, a strange calm settled over the island. The shaking stopped, and the air grew still. By the time Thorne's boots hit the white sands of the beach, the first stars were blinking in the twilight. They reached the small boat, still waiting where they had left it. There was no sign of Silas or his men. The jungle remained silent, its shadows retreating into the dense foliage as if the mountain had swallowed the malice of the pirates. "Let's get home," Thorne said, his voice weary but satisfied. As they rowed back to the Black Serpent, the crew on deck cheered. Arthur stood at the rail, his face lighting up as he saw the 5 of them return. They climbed the wooden ladder, and for the first time in days, Thorne felt the familiar, steady sway of his ship. It was the only home he truly knew. The final count. With the journey concluded, the crew gathered on the deck for a final moment of reflection. They had lost ropes, a few barrels of water, and a lot of sleep, but they had gained something legendary. The prize. The Emerald of the Deep. Value. Immeasurable. The cost. 1 small boat, 2 torn sails, and a lifelong fear of shadows. The gain. A bond that only the deep sea can forge. What do we do with it, Captain? Arthur asked, staring at the glowing stone on the central table. A stone like that, it's a lot of weight for one ship to carry. Thorne looked at the emerald. It was beautiful, but Sarah's words echoed in his mind. It's a heart. The source of everything. He looked back at the island. Without the stone, the green fire would fade, and the land of shadows would become just another silent rock in the ocean. We don't sell it, Thorne said firmly. Not yet. We take it to the great library in the north. We let the scholars study it, but we keep the location of this island a secret. The world isn't ready for Silas's kind to find this place again. Spoken like a man who's had enough excitement for 1 month. Martha said with a smirk. She walked to the wheel and gripped the wood. North, then. North. Thorne agreed. And Martha. Make it fast. I'm tired of the dark. The anchor was raised for the final time this journey. The sails caught the night wind, and the Black Serpent turned its back on the mysterious island. As they sailed away, Thorne stood at the stern. He watched the silhouette of the mountain shrink against the stars. The emerald pulsed one last time in his pocket, a soft, warm heartbeat, before settling into a quiet glow. The horizon was wide, the sea was deep, and for the first time in a long time, Captain Thorne knew exactly where he was going. The first few days away from the island were deceptively quiet. The Black Serpent sailed under clear skies, her hull cutting through the waves with a new, strange efficiency. But inside Captain Thorne's cabin, things were far from peaceful. The Emerald of the Deep sat on his desk, nestled in a velvet cloth. It didn't just glow, it seemed to breathe. Thorne found it harder to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard a sound like distant waves crashing against a shore that didn't exist. It was a low, rhythmic hum that vibrated in his very bones. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears, but with the mind. He began to notice that the crew was changing, too. Captain, Martha said, entering the cabin without knocking. Her eyes were tired, and she kept glancing at the stone. The men are restless. They aren't fighting, but they aren't talking either. It's too quiet on the deck. Even Arthur is spending more time staring at the horizon than checking the rigging. Thorne stood up, his hand instinctively hovering over the emerald. It's the stone. Martha. It's not just a gem. It's a piece of something much older than us. It's trying to connect to the sea, and we're just the tiny wooden box carrying it. He noticed a strange phenomenon. The water directly beneath the ship was now a vibrant, glowing turquoise, even in the middle of the deep blue ocean. It was as if the emerald was bleeding, its energy through the wood of the ship and into the water. This trail was beautiful, but Thorne knew it was a beacon. If we can see this glow, anyone within 10 miles can see it. Thorne muttered, We aren't just sailing, we're drawing a map right to our door. Sarah, the historian, joined them. She looked pale. I've been reading the back pages of Miller's logbook. Captain. There are symbols I didn't recognize before. They speak of the echo. It says the heart of the sea doesn't just protect its home, it calls to its kin. If we don't reach the Great Library soon, we might find ourselves surrounded by things that haven't seen the sun in 1,000 years. Thorne looked at the emerald. For a second, he thought he saw a face within the green depths. Not a human face, but a collection of shifting shadows and ancient light. He quickly covered it with the heavy velvet cloth. The hum in his head dimmed, but it didn't disappear. "Tell Arthur to double the watches," Thorne commanded, "and tell the crew to keep their eyes on the water, not just the horizon. Whatever is coming won't come from the sky." On the 5th day, the wind died completely. The sails of the Black Serpent hung limp and useless. The ocean became a sheet of polished glass, reflecting the hot, white sun. But the ship didn't stop. To the horror of the crew, the ship continued to move north at a steady, unnerving pace, as if an invisible hand was pulling them through the water. "We aren't catching any current, I know," Martha whispered at the wheel. The wheel moved on its own, clicking left and right as if guided by a ghostly pilot. She didn't dare touch it. Thorne walked to the railing and looked down into the clear, deep water. The turquoise glow was still there, but now there was something else. Deep below, perhaps 100 feet down, a massive shadow was moving. It was longer than the ship, a dark, sleek shape that shimmered with the same green light as the emerald. "Arthur, get the harpoons," Thorne shouted. "Captain, we can't hit what we can't see clearly," Arthur replied, his voice cracking. The experienced sailor looked truly afraid for the first time. "It's not a whale. It's moving too perfectly. It's staying exactly beneath the keel." Suddenly, the ship jolted. It wasn't a hit from a rock, but a vibration, as if something was singing against the wood. The emerald in Thorne's pocket grew hot, burning through the leather. He pulled it out, and the stone flared with an intense, warning light. "It's communicating," Sarah said, rushing to the rail. She held a translation of the ancient carvings. "The stone isn't calling for help. It's being hunted. That thing down there, it's a scavenger of the deep. In the old stories, they were the shadows that followed the gods, waiting for them to fall." The shadow began to rise. The water around the ship started to boil and bubble. A massive, pale eye, the size of a wagon wheel, opened just beneath the surface. It was a cold, intelligent eye, filled with a hunger that spanned centuries. "Fire the cannons into the water," Thorne roared. "Don't let it breach." The crew scrambled to the guns. The deck was a chaotic mess of screaming men and heavy metal. But as the first cannon was aimed, the water suddenly turned black. A thick, ink-like substance rose from the depths, obscuring everything. The ship began to tilt. Whatever was beneath them was no longer just following. It was starting to climb. The black ink smelled of ancient salt and rotted kelp. It coated the sides of the Black Serpent, making the wood as slippery as ice. The monster beneath them roared, a sound that wasn't a voice, but a vibration that shattered the glass windows in the captain's cabin. "Hold the line," Thorne cried, grabbing a rope to keep from sliding across the tilted deck. "Thomas, the oil. Light the water." Thomas and Peter hauled a barrel of whale oil to the side. They smashed the top and poured the thick, flammable liquid into the black ink surrounding the ship. Thorne grabbed a torch from the wall and threw it. The ocean erupted in a wall of orange fire. The heat was intense, singeing the eyebrows of the sailors. The monster below shrieked. The massive eye disappeared as the creature dove deep to escape the burning surface. The ship leveled out, rocking violently in the wake of the beast's retreat. "Did we kill it?" Peter gasped, wiping soot from his face. "No," Thorne said, looking at the emerald. The stone was still pulsing a dark, angry red. We just annoyed it. It's waiting for the fire to go out. Martha grabbed Thorne's arm. Captain, look at the sky. The fire did more than scare the beast. Thorne looked up. The thick, black smoke from the oil fire had risen into the air, but it wasn't blowing away. It was forming a perfect circle above the ship. And in the distance, through the smoke, a familiar sight appeared. Black sails. Dark wood, a ship that should have been at the bottom of a cave. The shadow. Arthur whispered. Silas was alive. He hadn't been killed by the cave-in. Somehow, he had escaped, and he was using the smoke and the chaos to close the gap. The pirate ship was moving fast, its black sails full of a wind that the Black Serpent couldn't feel. Between a monster and a ghost. Thorne muttered, drawing his sword. He felt a strange surge of energy from the emerald. It was as if the stone was feeding him its strength, preparing him for the final battle. Arthur, tell the men to prepare for a boarding. We aren't running anymore. If Silas wants this stone, he's going to have to take it from the bottom of the ocean. The two ships were now only a mile apart. The fire on the water was dying, and the great shadow beneath the waves was starting to rise once more. The hunt had become a war. The distance between the Black Serpent and the shadow closed with terrifying speed. Silas's ship didn't seem to care about the boiling water or the retreating monster. It rode high on the waves, its black sails unfurling like the wings of a predatory bird. Thorne could see Silas standing on the prow, his hand bandaged but his stance defiant. Arthur, swivel guns to the stern. Thorne commanded. We can't let them rake our deck. Aim for their rigging. If we can't outrun them, we'll make sure they can't follow. The first shot came from the shadow. A heavy iron ball skipped across the water, kicking up a plume of white spray before slamming into the Serpent's wooden hull. The ship groaned, wood splinting and flying across the deck. Sailors dove for cover. Return fire. Martha yelled, her voice cutting through the smoke. The Serpent's cannons roared in response. The deck bucked under Thorne's feet. A thick cloud of grey sulphurous smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Thorne looked at the emerald of the deep. It was glowing with a frantic, strobing light. Every time a cannon fired, the stone seemed to pulse in sync with the explosion. Then, something strange happened. As Silas's second volley approached, the green light from the emerald flared outward, creating a faint, shimmering dome over the Serpent. The incoming cannonballs didn't hit. They slowed down as if moving through thick honey, losing their momentum and falling harmlessly into the sea. The stone, it's protecting us. Sarah whispered, clutching a railing. No. Thorne said, his eyes narrowed. It's not protecting us. It's preserving its vessel. But look at the cost. The emerald was turning dark, almost black, at its center. The energy it used to stop the iron balls was draining something from the atmosphere. The air around the ship felt cold, unnaturally cold for a tropical sea. Frost began to form on the ropes and the brass fittings of the ship. On the shadow, Silas looked frustrated. He gestured wildly to his men. They began to prepare the grappling hooks. He didn't want to sink the Serpent anymore. He realized the stone was doing something he couldn't understand, and he wanted it more than ever. They're going to board us, Arthur warned. And Captain, the fire on the water is almost out. The beast. I can feel it coming back. The sea beneath them had gone quiet, a deep, heavy silence that was more frightening than the roar of the cannons. The emeralds, echo, had grown into a scream. Thorne knew they were trapped between a man who wouldn't die and a monster that couldn't be satisfied. The grappling hooks flew through the air, their iron teeth biting into the Serpent's rail. Silas's men, hardened criminals and desperate pirates, began to swing across the gap. Thorne drew his sword, the steel reflecting the eerie green light of the stone. Defend the middeck. Thorne roared. "Don't let them reach the cabin." The battle was a chaos of steel and screams. But just as the first pirate landed on the deck, the ocean erupted. A massive, pale tentacle, thicker than the main mast and covered in hooked suckers, slammed onto the deck of the Shadow. Another tentacle rose from the opposite side, wrapping itself around the Black Serpent. The scavenger of the deep had returned, and it didn't care about pirate rivalries. The two ships were suddenly pulled together, locked in the embrace of the monster. The wood screamed as the hulls ground against each other. Pirates and sailors alike were thrown from their feet. A third tentacle swept across the Serpent's deck, knocking two of Silas's men into the churning water below. "Thorne!" Silas screamed, swinging himself onto the Serpent's deck amidst the chaos. He ignored the monster, ignored the dying men. His eyes were only for the emerald. "Give it to me, and I'll end this." "You fool!" Thorne parried a strike from Silas while ducking under a swinging tentacle. "The monster is here because of the stone. If you take it, you're just the next meal." The scavenger began to pull both ships downward. The deck was tilting at a dangerous 45-degree angle. Water began to pour over the railings. The emerald was now vibrating so violently that it shattered the glass of the lantern it was sitting near. Thorne realized they couldn't fight the pirates and the monster at the same time. He looked at Martha, who was clinging to the wheel. He looked at Arthur, who was hacking at a tentacle with a boarding axe. "Everyone, listen." Thorne's voice boomed. "We have to overload the stone." "Sarah, the translation. How do we release the echo all at once?" Sarah looked terrified. "The carvings said it requires a sacrifice of will. You have to force the stone to see the monster as the enemy, but it will drain everything around it." Thorne grabbed the emerald. It felt like holding a piece of the sun. He looked at Silas, who was closing in. "Hold on to something." Thorne closed his eyes and focused every ounce of his anger, his fear, and his love for his crew into the stone. He didn't just hold it. He tried to become the stone. He pictured the monster, the cold eye, the grasping tentacles, and he pushed that image into the green fire. The emerald didn't just glow. It exploded. A wave of pure, emerald green light blasted outward in a perfect sphere. It wasn't fire, but it had the force of a hurricane. The pirates on the deck were blown back like autumn leaves. The tentacles of the scavenger shriveled as if touched by acid. The monster let out a sound that vibrated the very atoms of the ship, a mournful, subsonic wail, and dove for the safety of the abyss. But the light didn't stop. It began to spin, creating a massive vortex in the ocean. The Black Serpent and the Shadow were caught in the edge of the whirlpool. "The stone is out of control," Martha yelled, her hands bloody from trying to hold the wheel. Thorne was on his knees, his hands smoking from the heat of the emerald. He could feel his own energy being pulled into the gem. His vision was turning green. He saw Silas, who had been thrown against the mast, staring at him with a mix of awe and terror. "Break it, Thorne!" Sarah screamed. "If you don't break the connection, it will pull the whole sea down." With a final, agonizing effort, Thorne slammed the emerald face down into the salt-crusted wood of the deck. He covered it with his own body, cutting off the light's path to the sky. The vortex collapsed instantly. The sudden change in pressure sent a massive swell of water outward, pushing the two ships apart. The Black Serpent was tossed like a cork, spinning wildly before settling into the now quiet water. When the spray cleared, Thorne looked up. His hair had turned white at the temples, and his hands were scarred, but he was alive. He looked across the water. The Shadow was crippled, its masts snapped like toothpicks, drifting aimlessly into the mist. Silas was nowhere to be seen on the shattered deck. Is it over?" Peter asked, crawling out from under a pile of ropes. Thorne looked at the emerald. It was dim now, A dull, mossy green. It looked like a normal stone. For now, Thorne whispered. But the great library is still a long way off, and the sea has a long memory. The silence that followed the collapse of the vortex was more unsettling than the roar of the cannons. The Black Serpent drifted, her hull weeping seawater from a dozen fresh cracks. The air, once frigid, was now heavy and humid, smelling of ozone and spent magic. Thorne stood slowly, his legs feeling like lead. He looked at his hands. The skin was etched with faint, silvery lines that mirrored the internal structure of the emerald. "Captain," Martha said, her voice barely a whisper. She walked toward him, stepping over a pile of splintered wood. She reached out to touch his hair, now stark white at the temples, but hesitated. "You look different." "I feel different, Martha," Thorne replied. He picked up the emerald of the deep. It was heavy, cold, and entirely opaque. The vibrant green fire was gone, replaced by the dull, matte finish of a common river stone. "I think the stone gave everything it had to push back that beast. Or perhaps it took what it needed from me." Arthur began barking orders to the survivors. The crew moved like ghosts, their faces pale and eyes wide. They began the grim work of clearing the deck. They pushed the broken pieces of the pirate ship overboard and began plugging the leaks with tar and oakum. Of the shadow, there was nothing left but floating debris and a few struggling figures in the distance. Thorne watched them for a moment, then turned away. The sea would decide their fate. Sarah approached Thorne, carrying a thick blanket. She wrapped it around his shoulders. That blast wasn't just energy, Thorne. It was a localized reset. "Look at the compass." Thorne pulled the bronze compass from his belt. The needle was spinning in lazy, clockwise circles, refusing to settle on north, south, or any direction in between. "The magnetic field around the ship is shattered," Sarah explained. "The stone's discharge was so powerful it's blinded our instruments. We're sailing into the most treacherous part of the northern reach, and we're doing it blind. We still have the stars," Thorne said, looking up as the clouds began to part. "The stars won't help us where we're going." Martha interrupted, pointing toward the horizon. To the north, a massive, towering wall of white mist was rolling toward them. It wasn't a normal fog. It was a solid barrier of pearlescent vapor that seemed to glow with its own internal light. The sailors call it the Shroud of Memory. No ship that enters it ever comes out the same way it went in. Thorne looked from the dead stone in his hand to the approaching fog. He felt a faint tug in his chest, a sensation of being pulled toward that white wall. The emerald might be dormant, but the connection it had forged with his blood was still very much alive. "Then we don't sail into it," Thorne commanded. "We sail through it. If the great library is on the other side, that is where we must go." As the Black Serpent crossed the threshold into the fog, the world vanished. There was no sun, no moon, and no sea. The water became a flat, silver plain that didn't ripple when the ship passed through it. The sound of the wind died, replaced by a soft, constant whispering that seemed to come from the mist itself. "Keep the lanterns lit," Arthur shouted, though the light from the oil lamps struggled to penetrate even a few feet of the thick vapor. "Stay within sight of each other. If you fall overboard, we won't be able to find you." The crew huddled together on the middeck. The silence was so absolute that the sound of a footstep on the wood sounded like a thunderclap. Sarah sat near the mainmast, her books spread out around her. She was frantically searching for any mention of the shroud in the ancient texts. "It's a psychic barrier," she muttered, more to herself than to Thorne. "The island used the emerald to create these defenses. The shroud doesn't just hide the land. It reflects the mind of those who enter it. It shows you what you want, or what you fear most." Thorne stood at the prow, the emerald gripped tightly in his scarred hand. He didn't see the fog. Instead, he saw flashes of the port he had left behind, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of his father's voice, the feeling of a life without the burden of the sea. It was a tempting, warm vision. It wanted him to turn back, to give up the chase and return to a simpler time. "Don't listen to it," Martha said, appearing at his side. Her face was tight with concentration. "I see the farm I left 10 years ago. I can smell the rain on the dry earth. It feels so real." "Thorne. It's a trap." "Martha," Thorne said, his voice grating. He looked down at the emerald. He could feel a tiny, microscopic spark deep within the stone. It was responding to the shroud. It wasn't his memories the stone was reflecting. It was the mountain. It was the deep, cold peace of the earth. Suddenly, a shape appeared in the mist. It wasn't a ship, but a tall, jagged spire of ice. Then another, and another. They were entering a graveyard of icebergs, hidden within the fog. "Hard to port," Thorne roared, breaking the spell of the shroud. The ship groaned as Martha threw the wheel over. The Serpent missed the first iceberg by inches, the ice scraping along the hull with a sound like grinding teeth. Thorne realized the fog was intentionally leading them into the ice. The shroud wanted to sink them, to keep the emerald secrets at the bottom of the frozen north. "We need the stone," Thorne cried. He held the emerald up. "Wake up. You took my strength. Now give it back." He focused on the silvery lines in his skin, trying to push the energy back into the gem. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the emerald gave a single, deep pulse of emerald light. It wasn't a blast, but a beam, a narrow green ray that cut through the shroud like a hot knife through wax, showing a clear path of black water through the ice. With the emerald acting as a searchlight, the Black Serpent threaded through the needle of the ice field. But the shroud wasn't finished with them. As the green beam cut the mist, the whispers grew into voices. The crew began to see figures standing on the ice, men and women they had lost at sea over the years. "Is that Peter?" Arthur whispered, pointing to a figure on a passing berg. It was a sailor who had been washed overboard during the great storm in Chapter 8. The figure didn't speak. It only watched them with eyes that were as white as the fog. "Don't look at them," Thorne commanded, but even he found it hard to turn away. He saw Captain Miller from the ghostly wreck, standing on a floating piece of wood, holding his blue logbook. Miller pointed a skeletal finger toward the north, his mouth moving in a silent warning. "He's saying we're going too deep," Sarah interpreted, her voice trembling. "He's saying the library isn't what we think it is." The green light from the emerald began to flicker. The stone was struggling to maintain the path. Every time a ghost appeared, the light dimmed. Thorne realized the stone was sensitive to their emotions. The more the crew succumbed to the visions, the weaker their protection became. "Sing!" Thorne suddenly shouted. The crew looked at him as if he had gone mad. "Sing what, Captain?" Peter asked. "A sea shanty. Anything. Something loud and real." Thorne began to belt out a low, rhythmic song they had used to raise the anchor in the very beginning. One by one, the crew joined in. Martha's alto mixed with Arthur's deep bass. The sound of human voices, full of life and grit, pushed back the ethereal whispers of the shroud. As the song grew louder, the ghosts on the ice began to dissolve into mist. The emerald's light stabilized, turning a fierce, steady green. The icebergs seemed to pull back, as if the ship's collective will was creating a physical space in the fog. "Look!" Martha cried, pointing ahead. The white wall of the shroud was thinning. Through the gaps, Thorne saw something that made his heart skip. It wasn't land, but a structure of such immense size that it defied logic. A series of massive, arched bridges made of white stone rose out of the freezing sea, connecting a cluster of islands. In the center of these islands stood a tower that reached so high it disappeared into the clouds. The Great Library of the North. Sarah breathed, her eyes welling with tears. The Alexandria of the Tides. We actually found it. As the Black Serpent sailed out of the shroud, the emerald in Thorne's hand went completely dark once more. It had done its job. But as they approached the white arches, Thorne saw that they weren't alone. A dozen other ships, ancient and modern, were docked at the base of the tower, and on the highest bridge, a line of figures in long, silver robes stood waiting. The great library did not look like any building Thorne had ever seen. It was a fortress of knowledge, built into the side of a massive iceberg that had been frozen to the sea floor for millennia. The white stone arches were etched with runes that hummed with a low, harmonic frequency, vibrating through the hull of the Black Serpent. As the ship glided toward a stone pier, the figures in silver robes remained motionless. They didn't carry weapons, but they radiated a sense of absolute authority. Thorne stepped onto the dock first, the emerald of the deep tucked into his belt. He felt small beneath the towering architecture. "I am Captain Thorne of the Black Serpent," he announced, his voice echoing against the ice walls. "We seek the keeper of the tides. We bring the heart of the sea." The robed figures parted, and an elderly woman with skin like cracked parchment stepped forward. She wore a pendant made of sea glass that caught the dying light of the northern sun. "I am High Scholar Ilara," she said. Her voice was thin but carried the weight of ages. "We have been watching your trail of green fire across the ocean. Captain, you are much later than we expected." "We had complications," Thorne said, glancing back at his battered ship and weary crew. Ilara's eyes fell on the emerald. She didn't look at it with greed, but with a profound, weary sadness. "The stone is sleeping. You have used it to fight shadows and monsters, but you do not know what it truly is. It is not a weapon, Captain. It is a record." She gestured for them to follow. Martha and Sarah joined Thorne, while Arthur stayed behind to guard the ship. They entered the main hall, a space so vast it had its own weather. Clouds of mist drifted near the ceiling, and millions of scrolls were stored in honeycomb shelves that climbed the walls. "Each scroll is a memory of the sea," Ilara explained. "But the emerald is the index. It holds the history of every wave that has ever broken and every ship that has ever sunk. And right now, it is screaming." Thorne frowned. "It feels silent to me." "That is because you are only listening with your ears," Ilara replied. She led them to a circular pedestal in the center of a room filled with floating globes of light. "Place the stone here. It is time for you to see the truth of what you carry." As Thorne placed the emerald on the pedestal, the room went pitch black. Then, a single point of light ignited within the gem. It didn't pulse. It exploded into a three-dimensional map of the entire planet. The water on the map wasn't blue, but a shimmering gold, showing the flow of the world's currents. The stone was created by the first mariners. Ilara's voice came from the darkness. They didn't want to conquer the sea. They wanted to understand its soul. They forged the emerald to balance the tides. But man is a creature of imbalance. The map shifted. Thorne saw the island from Chapter 10. He saw it not as a jungle, but as a gleaming city of marble and light. Then, he saw the greedy man from the wall of history, the one Sarah had pointed out. He saw the man steal the stone from its original pedestal. The golden currents on the map turned black. The shadows they had fought in the mountain weren't monsters. They were the corrupted memories of the sea, transformed into dark energy when the stone's balance was broken. Thorne watched as the marble city was swallowed by the jungle in a matter of days. The emerald protects itself by reflecting the heart of its bearer, Ilara said. "In your hands, it became a shield because you sought to protect your crew. In Silas's hands, it would have become a plague. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes wide. If it's a record, can it show us the future? The future is a series of ripples. Ilara replied. But the stone shows a great wave coming. Look. The map zoomed in on the northern reach. A dark blot was spreading from the very spot where they had fought the scavenger of the deep. It was a tear in the fabric of the ocean. A void where nothing could live. Your overload of the stone in the vortex saved your lives. Ilara said solemnly. But it cracked the foundation of the sea. The void is growing. If the heart isn't returned to its true home and healed, the tides will stop. And when the tides stop, the world dies. Thorne felt a cold dread. We can't go back there. Silas's men are there. The monster is there. And the mountain is collapsed. There is another way. Ilara said, pointing to a hidden passage beneath the library. But it requires a journey through the sunless sea. The rivers that flow beneath the tectonic plates. The decision was made quickly. There was no going back to the port, and no staying in the safety of the library. The void was growing, and Thorne felt the silvery lines in his skin pulse with a warning heat. The High Scholars provided the Black Serpent with a new set of sails, woven from silver thread and reinforced with whalebone. These ghost sails didn't need wind. They moved by catching the magnetic currents of the earth. The sunless sea is a world of pressure and silence. Ilara warned Thorne as they prepared to depart. You will be sailing through the veins of the world. Do not let the darkness talk to you. The ship entered a massive sea cave at the base of the library. The water here was warm, heated by volcanic vents far below. As the light of the surface faded, the ghost sails began to glow with a soft, bioluminescent white. It's like we're sailing through a cathedral. Martha whispered. The walls of the tunnel were covered in crystals that reflected the ship's light, creating a kaleidoscope of colors. But as they descended deeper, the beauty faded into an oppressive, heavy gloom. The pressure made the hull of the serpent creak and groan. Arthur walked the decks, checking every bolt and plank. She's holding, Captain, but we're deeper than any wooden ship has a right to be. Suddenly, the water began to move in a tight, fast spiral. They weren't sailing anymore. They were being pulled down a massive subterranean flume. Hold on! Thorne shouted, grabbing the emerald. The stone began to hum a low, deep note that matched the vibration of the earth. Out of the darkness, a city appeared. But not a city of men. It was a city of stone and coral, built by a race that had never seen the sun. Giant, jellyfish-like creatures floated between the spires, their long tentacles acting as power lines for the city's dim, purple glow. The dwellers of the abyss. Sarah whispered. The legends said they were the guardians of the world's roots. One of the giant creatures drifted toward the Black Serpent. Its massive, pulsating bell was larger than the ship. A voice, sounding like grinding stones, echoed in Thorne's mind. The heart returns, but it is broken. Who are you to carry the life of the world? Thorne stood tall, holding the emerald high. The green light clashed with the purple glow of the abyss. I am the one who fought for it. I am the one who will see it home. The creature paused, its many eyes blinking in sequence. Then you must pass the trial of the deep. Only those who have lost everything can save the world. The giant jellyfish-like dweller did not move, but the water around the Black Serpent began to shimmer with an intense, violet frequency. Thorne felt the wooden deck beneath his feet dissolve, not into splinters, but into memory. One by one, the crew fell into a waking trance, their eyes turning the same milky purple as the creature's eyes. Thorne found himself standing on the deck of his very first ship, the Sea Ghost. It was the night of the great gale, the night he had lost his father. The wind was a howling banshee, and the waves were mountains of black glass. He saw his younger self reaching out for a hand that was slipping away into the foam. It wasn't your fault. A voice whispered in the spray. It was the dweller, testing the cracks in his soul. But you carry the guilt like an anchor. If you take the heart back to the mountain, you will carry the weight of the entire world. Why do you choose this burden? Across the deck, he saw Martha weeping. She was back on her dry, dusty farm, watching her family walk away because there was no water and no hope. Sarah was surrounded by burning books, the knowledge she craved turning to ash before she could read a single word. Each of them was being stripped bare, their deepest regrets laid out like salt on a wound. We choose it because we are all we have. Thorne roared, not at the vision, but at the darkness behind it. He gripped the emerald of the deep. The silvery lines in his skin began to glow, cutting through the purple haze. The sea takes, but it also gives. It gave me this crew. It gave Martha a purpose. It gave Sarah a mystery worth solving. The vision of the sea ghost began to crack. Thorne realized the trial wasn't about being perfect. It was about being honest. He stepped toward the memory of his father and, instead of reaching out in desperation, he gave a slow, respectful nod of farewell. The violet light snapped. Thorne was back on the deck of the Black Serpent. Martha was wiping her eyes, her jaw set in a hard line. Sarah was clutching her satchel, her gaze fierce. The giant jellyfish pulsed once, a deep, resonant sound that felt like a blessing. You carry the weight because you know its value. The voice echoed one last time. Pass through the gate of iron. The roots of the world await. The creature drifted aside, revealing a massive, jagged rift in the canyon floor. It was a vertical drop into a world of pure shadow. Thorne didn't hesitate. Arthur, prepare the ghost sails. We're diving. As the Black Serpent descended into the rift, the pressure became a physical entity. The ship's hull, reinforced by the great library scholars, groaned under the weight of miles of overhead ocean. Every plank screamed, a high-pitched scream that set everyone's teeth on edge. Captain, the seams are weeping. Arthur shouted, pointing to the lower deck where tiny jets of water were spraying through the wood with the force of needles. If we go any deeper, the serpent will collapse like an empty eggshell. The ghost sails. Thorne commanded. We need more than speed. We need a shield. The silver sails began to ripple, not with wind, but with a rhythmic, electromagnetic pulse. The emerald in Thorne's hand responded, casting a sphere of green light that pushed against the crushing weight of the water. Inside the sphere, the air was cold and still. Outside, the water was a black slurry of minerals and ancient salts. No one speaks. Sarah whispered. She was monitoring a strange device given to them by Alara, a glass sphere filled with mercury. The liquid was compressed into a tiny, vibrating ball. The silence is what keeps the pressure equalized. Any loud vibration could shatter the protective field. The crew moved like ghosts. They communicated through hand signals and nods. Peter and Thomas used mallets wrapped in heavy cloth to gently tap corking back into the leaking seams. The only sound was the rhythmic thump of the emerald, which had become the ship's second heart. They passed through a forest of giant, crystalline stalactites that hung from the ceiling of the subterranean sea. Some were miles long, glowing with a faint, inner heat. Thorne navigated by instinct, his hand on the tiller, feeling the flow of the tectonic rivers. He could feel the mountain, the island's mountain, calling to him from the dark. The mercury in Sarah's glass sphere suddenly expanded, filling the globe with a silver flash. The pressure is dropping. She mouthed silently. Ahead, the darkness began to thin. A strange orange glow appeared on the horizon. Not the sun, but the fire of the earth. They were entering the volcanic veins that led directly to the heart of the island. The water temperature began to rise rapidly. The cold, crushing silence of the abyss was replaced by the low, guttural roar of magma moving behind stone walls. The Black Serpent was now sailing through a series of massive, basalt pipes, natural conduits formed by ancient eruptions. The current is picking up. Martha called out, her voice straining against the roar. The ghost sails were glowing a bright, fiery orange, reflecting the lava that flowed in separate channels parallel to their path. The ship was moving at a terrifying speed, carried by a thermal updraft of boiling water. "Look at the walls." Sarah pointed. The basalt was etched with the same star maps they had seen in the statue's forehead. These weren't just tunnels. They were a highway built by the first mariners. The emerald in Thorne's hand was now a brilliant, screaming green. It was home. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a vast, subterranean cathedral. Above them, a massive column of white stone rose into the darkness, the root of the island's mountain. But the sight that stopped Thorne's heart was the base of the column. The void they had heard about was there. It was a jagged hole in the reality of the sea, a place where the water simply vanished into nothingness. Around the void, the stone was crumbling, and dark, oily shadows were pouring out of the rift. "The island is bleeding," Thorne muttered, and in the center of the chaos, clinging to a ledge of obsidian, was a ghost. Or so it seemed. A battered, broken ship was caught in the swirling currents near the void. Its masts were gone, its hull was scorched, but the black flag still fluttered in the thermal wind. "The shadow," Arthur growled. "How in the name of the deep did Silas get down here?" Silas hadn't used the library or the dwellers. He had been sucked into the vortex Thorne created, and the sea had spit him out at the very bottom of the world. Now, he was standing on the ruins of his ship, holding a jagged piece of obsidian, staring at the void with eyes that had gone completely mad. "He's not trying to save it," Sarah whispered in horror. "He's trying to feed it." The air at the roots of the world was thick with the scent of sulfur and the hum of dying magic. Silas stood upon the tilting deck of the shadow, his silhouette flickering against the orange glow of the surrounding magma. He looked less like a man and more like a splinter of the dark itself. In his hand, the jagged shard of obsidian he held was pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic black light, mirroring the hunger of the void. "You're too late, Thorne," Silas shrieked, his voice carrying over the roar of the subterranean thermal vents. "The sea didn't spit me out, it showed me the truth. The emerald is a cage, a lock on a door that was never meant to stay shut. Imagine the power of the nothingness behind it." Thorne gripped the railing of the Black Serpent. The ghost sails were rippling violently, struggling to keep the ship stable against the gravitational pull of the rift. "It's not power, Silas. It's an end. If that void opens any further, there won't be a sea left for you to rule." Silas laughed, a sound like grinding stones. He raised the obsidian shard high. The oily shadows pouring from the rift seemed to respond, coiling around his arm like loyal hounds. "Then let it end. If I cannot have the heart of the sea, I will be the one who stops its beat. Arthur, bring us alongside," Thorne commanded. "Martha, Thomas, prepare to board. We have to get to that pedestal before he feeds the obsidian to the rift." The serpent surged forward, her silver sails catching the erratic energy of the cavern. The two ships, both scarred and broken, collided once more. This time, there were no grappling hooks, just the raw force of two captains driven by opposing fates. As Thorne leaped across the gap, the shadows from the void lunged at him. The emerald of the deep flared in his belt, the green light acting as a blade of purity that sliced through the darkness. But the closer he got to Silas, the more the pressure increased. The silver lines on Thorne's skin were burning, glowing so brightly they were visible through his heavy coat. He wasn't just carrying the stone, he was becoming the conduit for its final stand. The ground, or what passed for ground at the base of the world, shuddered. A massive crack split the obsidian ledge where the shadow was pinned. The void was no longer just a hole. It was a mouth, widening with every passing second. The water that fell into it didn't splash, it simply ceased to exist, creating a vacuum that pulled at the very souls of the crew. "The structure is failing," Sarah cried out from the Serpent's deck. She held the mercury sphere, which was now spinning so fast it looked like a solid silver coin. "Thorne, the mountain's root is vibrating at a frequency the stone can't match. You have to bridge the gap." Thorne tackled Silas just as the pirate reached the edge of the rift. They rolled across the scorched wood of the shadow, the emerald and the obsidian shard clashing. The emerald didn't just glow. It seemed to scream in Thorne's mind, a chorus of 1,000 tides demanding to be heard. "Give it to me," Silas hissed, his fingers clawing at Thorne's throat. His eyes had turned entirely black, reflecting the void behind him. He was no longer a man. He was a vessel for the rift's hunger. Thorne pushed Silas back, the silvery lines on his arms pulsing with an agonizing heat. He realized then that the emerald wasn't just a record or a battery. It was a patch. It was a living piece of the world meant to fill the hole that greed had created. But to fill the hole, it needed a human anchor, someone who knew the weight of the sea and was willing to bear it. "Martha, take the ship back," Thorne yelled over his shoulder. "Not without you, Captain," Martha shouted back, her hands white on the wheel as she fought to keep the serpent from being sucked into the vacuum. "The stone needs a heartbeat to reset the seal," Thorne realized, his voice calm despite the chaos. He looked at the emerald. It was no longer a dull stone. It was a swirling nebula of green fire. He could feel the mountain beneath him, the tectonic plates shifting, the very roots of the island waiting for the pulse to return. Silas made a final, desperate lunge, the obsidian shard aimed at Thorne's heart. But Thorne didn't dodge. He grabbed Silas's wrist, the silvery lines on his skin flaring with a blinding light that forced the shadows back. With his other hand, Thorne slammed the emerald of the deep into the center of the obsidian pedestal at the base of the white stone column. The reaction was instantaneous. A pillar of pure, emerald light erupted from the pedestal, shooting straight up through the root of the mountain. The green energy didn't just push the shadows back, it dissolved them, turning the oily darkness into harmless mist. The void began to shrink, the edges of the reality tear knitting themselves back together like a healing wound. "No!" Silas screamed as the obsidian shard in his hand shattered into dust. Without the rift to feed him, the darkness that had sustained him vanished. He fell back, his body suddenly frail and old, as the shadow finally succumbed to the crumbling ledge and slid into the closing rift. Thorne didn't let go of the emerald. He couldn't. The energy was flowing through him, using his body as a bridge between the stone and the mountain. He felt the history of the sea, every storm, every sunrise, every whale song, pouring into his mind. It was too much for a human heart to hold. Yet he held it. "Captain." Arthur's voice seemed to come from miles away. The cavern was filled with a brilliant, golden-green light. The thermal vents stabilized, the magma retreated into its channels, and the roaring silence of the void was replaced by the steady, rhythmic thrum of a healthy world. As the rift finally snapped shut, a massive shockwave of energy sent the Black Serpent reeling. Thorne was thrown back from the pedestal, his body hitting the stone floor. The emerald remained in the pillar, glowing with a soft, eternal light, finally returned to its true home. Thorne lay on the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The silvery lines on his skin were gone, replaced by faint, translucent scars. He looked up at the ceiling of the cavern, miles of rock above him, and for the first time in his life, he felt a peace that was deeper than the ocean itself. The silence following the closure of the void was not empty. It was a heavy, resonant peace that filled the cavern like water filling a dry well. Thorne lay on the obsidian floor, his chest heaving. The translucent scars on his arms, the remnants of the silver lines, shimmered with a faint, dying light. He felt a profound sense of loss, as if a part of his soul had been left behind in the pedestal with the stone, but it was balanced by an overwhelming lightness. Martha was the first to reach him. She skidded across the smooth stone, her boots clicking in the quiet. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. "Thorne. Captain, talk to me." Thorne opened his eyes. They were no longer reflecting the green fire of the emerald. They were just the eyes of a man who had seen too much. He managed a weak smile. "The sea. It's quiet. Martha, can you hear it?" The screaming stopped. Arthur, Thomas, and Sarah joined them, forming a circle around their fallen leader. Above them, the Emerald of the Deep sat perfectly encased in the white stone column. It didn't pulse with the frantic energy of a weapon anymore. Instead, it glowed with a steady, rhythmic light that matched the natural vibration of the earth. The heart was beating again, and through it, the island was being fed. Observation. The restoration of balance. Thermal vents. Stabilized at a constant 85 degrees. Structural integrity. The obsidian ledges have fused, sealing the rift. Aura. The oppressive weight of the abyss has been replaced by a neutral, buoyant pressure. The ship. Thorne whispered, trying to sit up. "Is she still afloat?" Arthur looked back at the Black Serpent. The ghost sails were no longer orange with volcanic fire. They had turned a brilliant, iridescent white. The cracks in the hull that had been weeping seawater were now sealed with a strange, translucent resin. The mountain's own way of thanking the vessel that had brought its heart home. "She's more than afloat, Captain," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "She looks like she's ready to fly." The library scholars knew what they were doing when they gave us those sails. They're reacting to the stone's new frequency. Sarah stood by the pedestal, her hand hovering just inches from the emerald. She didn't touch it. "It's beautiful, isn't it? It's no longer a treasure to be stolen. It's an anchor. It's what keeps this part of the world from drifting into the dark. We did it. Thorne. We actually did it." Thorne stood up, leaning heavily on Martha and Arthur. He looked at the emerald one last time. He felt a phantom hum in his blood, a final thank you from the first mariners. But the cavern was starting to change. With the void sealed, the subterranean currents were shifting. The water was beginning to rise, not in a flood, but in a controlled, upward surge. "We need to go," Thorne commanded, his voice regaining its strength. "The mountain is waking up, and she's going to want to push everything out to the surface. Let's get to the ship." The journey back up through the veins of the world was nothing like the terrifying descent. As the Black Serpent moved into the main basalt pipe, the water didn't crush the hull, it lifted it. The ghost sails caught the upward thermal currents, pulling the ship toward the surface with a grace that felt supernatural. "Look at the crystals," Sarah shouted, pointing to the walls of the tunnel. The jagged, dark rocks they had passed on the way down were now blooming. Small, glowing polyps and bioluminescent mosses were spreading across the basalt, fed by the restored energy of the heart. The sunless sea was no longer a graveyard. It was becoming a garden. Thorne stood at the prow, his hand on the railing. He felt the ship's pulse through the wood. The Black Serpent was no longer just a collection of planks and nails. She had been salted by the magic of the deep. She moved through the water with almost zero friction, a silver ghost returning to the world of men. "Mercury is stable, Captain," Sarah called out, holding up the glass sphere. The liquid inside was no longer compressed or spinning. It sat perfectly still, a silver mirror reflecting the ship's internal peace. They passed through the gate of iron and back into the territory of the dwellers. The giant jellyfish-like creatures were waiting. As the serpent sailed past, they pulsed in a slow, rhythmic sequence, a salute to the guardians who had succeeded. The violet light of the abyss felt warm now, like the glow of a hearth rather than the cold eye of a judge. "How long do you think it's been?" Peter asked, looking up at the dark ceiling of the cavern. "Days. Weeks. Time moves differently down here," Martha replied, her eyes fixed on the wheel. "But I don't care if it's been 100 years. I just want to see the sky." Suddenly, the upward current accelerated. The water around the ship turned from black to a deep, dark blue. Then, a pale, shimmering light began to filter down from above. It wasn't the green of the emerald, but the honest, filtered light of the sun hitting the ocean surface. "Brace yourselves," Thorne roared. "We're coming up." The ship hit the transition layer between the subterranean rivers and the open ocean. There was a moment of intense pressure, a sound like a giant indrawn breath, and then, the Black Serpent erupted from the water. The ship broke the surface in the center of the bay, sending a massive plume of white spray into the air. For a moment, the crew was blinded by the brilliance of the sun. It was mid-afternoon, and the sky was a piercing, perfect blue. The air was sweet with the scent of jasmine, salt, and wet earth. "Look at the island," Martha whispered, her voice full of awe. The island they had first stepped upon, a place of dark jungles, haunted statues, and oppressive shadows, was gone. In its place was a paradise. The trees were no longer a tangled, aggressive wall of green. They were vibrant and lush, their leaves shimmering with health. Thousands of colorful birds took flight from the canopy as the ship appeared, their songs filling the air. The great stone statue of the man with the beard stood on the hill, but the moss that had covered it like a shroud had withered away. The stone was now a clean, slate gray, and the carvings on its forehead, the star maps, glowed with a soft, natural silver light. The statue didn't look like a warning anymore. It looked like a host. The waterfall. Thorne pointed toward the mountain. The thin, blue curtain of water they had stepped through to find the secret entrance was now a thundering, majestic cascade. It fell into a pool that was so clear they could see the white sand on the bottom from the ship's deck. The land of shadows had been reborn as the Isle of the Heart. "What about Silas?" Thomas asked, looking toward the beach. "Gone," Thorne said, and he knew it was true. Silas had been a creature of the void's hunger. When the void was sealed, there was nothing left for a man like him to cling to. He was a memory the sea had finally decided to forget. Thorne looked at his crew. They were battered, scarred, and exhausted, but they stood tall. They were the only people in the world who knew the truth of what lay beneath the waves. They were no longer just pirates or sailors. They were the keepers of a secret that held the world together. "We can't stay here," Thorne said, though his heart pulled him toward the shore. "This place needs to remain a myth. If the world finds out what happened here, the greed will return. We have to be the ones who ensure the island stays hidden." "Where to, then, Captain?" Martha asked, a small, knowing smile on her face. Thorne looked at the horizon. The sea was wide, the winds were fair, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to hunt for anything. "Home, Martha. Let's go home." The Black Serpent sailed away from the Isle of the Heart as the sun began its slow descent into the western sea. The island, once a place of jagged terror, was now a silhouette of vibrant beauty, eventually dissolving into a golden haze. Thorne stood at the stern, his hands resting on the salt-crusted railing. The translucent scars on his skin no longer hummed, but they remained as a map of the journey, a permanent reminder that he had touched the pulse of the world. "The ghost sails are fading, Captain," Arthur reported, looking up at the silver cloth. The iridescent glow was slowly returning to a standard, rugged canvas white. The magic was receding, leaving the ship as she had been, a sturdy vessel of wood and iron, though perhaps a bit more alive than before. "That's as it should be, Arthur," Thorne replied. "We don't need magic to find our way back. We have the wind, and we have each other." The legacy of the heart. As the weeks passed and the crew steered toward the familiar waters of the southern ports, the reality of their adventure began to settle. They were the wealthiest people on the ocean, though not in the way they had once imagined. Sarah spent her nights in the cabin, writing a new logbook. She didn't write for the great library or for history books. She wrote for the crew. She recorded the truth of the emerald so that, should the tides ever fail again, the knowledge would exist, hidden in a language only they understood. Martha never let go of the wheel. She had seen the roots of the world and realized that no storm could ever truly scare her again. She became the soul of the serpent, a navigator who could read the water not just by its color, but by its heartbeat. Thomas and Peter shared stories over rum, though they noticed that they spoke less of the gold in the Hall of Gold and more of the light in the sunless sea. They had learned that the greatest treasure wasn't something you could spend, but something you had to protect. The final port. When the Black Serpent finally pulled into the harbor of their home port, the bells rang out to welcome the ghost ship back from the dead. People gathered at the docks, whispering about Thorne's white hair and the strange, polished look of the ship's hull. "Where's the treasure, Thorne?" A rival captain shouted from the docks, his eyes gleaming with greed. "Where's the legendary emerald?" Thorne looked at Martha and Sarah. He thought of the stone sitting in its white pedestal miles beneath the island, keeping the world in balance. He thought of Silas, lost to his own darkness. The emerald was a myth. Thorne called back, his voice steady and clear. "We found nothing but salt water and old rocks. But we found a ship that can survive the bottom of the world, and a crew that doesn't blink at shadows. That's more than enough for me." The crowd grumbled, disappointed by the lack of gems, but the crew of the Serpent shared a silent, knowing look. They didn't need the world's approval. That night, Thorne sat alone on the deck, looking at his bronze compass. The needle was no longer spinning. It pointed true north, steady and firm. He took a deep breath of the harbor air, smelling of wood smoke and old rope, and felt the final pieces of the journey click into place. He had sought the heart of the sea to save his ship, but in the end, the sea had saved his heart. "Martha!" Thorne called out softly into the cool night air. "Yes, Captain." She answered from the shadows of the quarterdeck. "Ready the supplies. We leave at dawn." "And where are we going this time?" Thorne looked out past the harbor lights to where the stars met the dark water. The horizon was a promise, and the sea was a story that never truly ended. "Somewhere we haven't been," Thorne said with a smile. "Somewhere new."